Okay. Everyone good to go then? Someone
Yep.
sat on their keyboard in this
Yeah.
Google Doc. Right, I guess we can start off with quick introductions. People that don't know me, I'm Toe Grinder. I'm a mage player. I've been playing mage for a couple of years now. I think since Legion. I run magehub.com and I am the GM of the guild Mist on Taramil EU. Porum, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, I'm Porum. I write the Arcane guide and help work on the Arcane APL for Wowhead rather for the guide, and I raid with Divergent on Area 52. That's it.
Yeah. Darvin, do you want to go?
Yeah. I write the Wowhead Frost Guide, and I'm a developer for Simulation Craft, and I'm also currently an analyst in BDG.
You're not going to drop that like X World First Raider. You're just going to leave
Yeah,
that
I am a
like that
former
is too
BDG raider from
too
like
far down the
two
list.
tiers ago, yeah.
We'll
But
just draw the line here, and then we'll cut off everything below there. Cool. And last but not least,
Well, my only qualification. Oh, sorry, I'm nowhere near. My only qualification is that I'm a simulation craft developer, and that's pretty much all you need to know about me.
sweet. Okay, so yeah, getting together here, just going to talk about the changes to Mage in 10.15. Obviously, there's been quite a few changes varying across the couple of specs. So do we want to start with just the generic class changes? Obviously, they have different levels of impact on each of the different specs, but just kind of see what we can say starting off about the class changes. Norner, do you maybe want to kick us off with your initial thoughts on the class tree changes? I can bring up the class tree as well while we're
Well,
talking.
overall, I'm quite happy with the changes. I mean, there are still some things they didn't, some dead talents that they didn't quite fix. But overall, the tree is a lot nicer in that it actually removed most of the complaints about having DPS capstones, which was like one of the most annoying things about the old tree. In that you basically like your utility was given by which were the best performing capstones, and you couldn't really choose like, okay, shifting power was the best, so you had to pick like the three talents that lead to it, and you basically had no choice. With the new tree, you will just have one DPS capstone, which is fairly easy to reach, and then after you reach it, you can basically just put everything else into utility that you want, which is a really nice change. Like all of the, apart from that one, all the DPS capstones are super easy to get, so there won't be any like issues pathing around the tree. We're also getting like a lot of extra utility and defensives and so on, which I'm sure that we'll touch on more as we go on. But yeah, I think that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, I think like the thing where you didn't have that much or you had too much like throughput in the class tree is kind of interesting because I've heard other people from like other classes like complaining that there's not enough throughput, and like I don't necessarily think that throughput in the class tree is a good thing. Like I logged into my Warlock after a while and it's like there's now more throughput in the class tree, and then that starts to like dictate where you can path and which utility things you're picking up. So yeah, I kind of like the idea of class trees being very throughput light. Um, so I think the two big changes, I suppose, in terms of like defensive or utility, or I guess it's technically three because it's a choice node, would be mass barrier, mass invis, and ice cold. Um, yeah, what are your, I guess, Darwin, what are your sort of initial thoughts on the new kind of capstones here?
So in general, it's adding a lot of new, very useful utility to Mage. Ice Cold, one of the problems that Ice Block has always have is that it's on the GCD and you have to sit in it to use it as a defensive. And that just makes mages, they're really good at surviving short, like big spikes of damage, but not as good if they lasted more than a few seconds, like longer than Greater Invis would last. And so Ice Cold gives us a much better way to deal with that sort of thing, especially if you combine it with the talent that makes it heal you, Cyro Freeze. And so that's a
Yeah,
really great new addition. And I think that's probably like in most cases, it's probably just going to be taken on every single fight in every dungeon, unless you really need the immunity for something, because it's just so good that you can use it off GCD.
Yeah, I didn't realize this interacted with cryo freeze at first. Whenever I first saw this, I didn't realize you get all 3 capstones as well. I was like, wow, this is terrible. You're never going to play this. You're just going to keep blocking and play the other one. And then I was like messing about with the tree, and I suddenly had all 3 of them, and I was like, wow, okay, this is suddenly a lot better. Yeah, I think Mass Barrier and Mass Invis are really nice as well. Mass Invis lasts slightly less time than Shroud, but I think there are a lot of invis skips in the game where you don't need the full Shroud duration anyway. So I think like in Mythic Plus, especially if you've got a Druid and you have like Stampeding Roar, or you use like a movement speed increase before you use Mass Invis, like there's definitely a lot of places where you'd use skips there. Mass Barrier is also pretty good. Maybe like less so in Raid, but I mean, it's the Evoker DR call that only goes on like 5 people. Zephyr? Yeah, I mean, like that's pretty decent in Raid. I mean, like get a sign of their healing assignments, so I don't see why Mass Barrier wouldn't. But it is a lot better for Arcane than it is for the other 2 specs, I guess. Especially in Raid.
Yeah, so one interesting thing about the mass barriers is that they get like they benefit from a lot of the other talents you can pick. So for example, if you mass barrier and you have the talent which makes your barriers remove slows, you'll just do it on everyone, unless they changed that very recently. For Arcane, that means that your barrier will actually reduce magical damage taken, which is a pretty big deal. The effects for Frost and Fire are maybe not as exciting. Obviously, Frost has slightly bigger barrier, and we get the slow, which is basically useless in PvE. And Fire has like the payback damage, which is also completely useless.
Yeah. Energized barriers is really good in. I don't know if there's that many applications in Raid, but I know like in dungeons, you've got like the Entangled affix this season. I've not been pushing M+ this season yet, but like last season you had like the first boss in Court of Stars, like his jump ability that he puts on you is technically a slow, so you can remove it. Things like that. Like I imagine there's a lot more like things that are flagged as slows, but like have another effect that you can then remove the other effect. So
even in Raid, I mean, Broodkeeper Encounter had the AoE slow that did a lot of damage, and just removing that on 5 people is pretty insane. Another point to add too is in the Arcane Spectre, you have the improved Prismatic Barrier talent, and you can actually get a 25% DR on your party with that, which is absolutely incredibly powerful buff to give everyone. And it also reduces the magic effects by 40% with the talent. So it's pretty absurdly strong with Arcane, especially.
Yeah, 15 I think goes to 25 or goes to 35.
What's that?
Sorry, I think it's 15 goes to 25.
No, it's 25 and then gets 15 more. They buffed Prismatic Barrier a while back with the powerful magic reduction.
The Wohead tooltips must be out of date. I'll ignore those from now on. But yeah, that's pretty.
I actually think Mass Invis is kind of on, like, it's kind of up on what's the word I'm looking for? It's ready to die, I think. I don't even think it's like ever going to be something that we really consider in PvE, just because of how strong Mass Barrier is kind of looking so far. And I think maybe in PvP it has a place, but I'm kind of hesitant. I think maybe after like a raid fight, you'll swap to Mass Invis and do a trash skip or something with it, and then swap back for the actual fight, right?
Yeah. I'm curious to see how it goes in dungeons, just because Mass Invis is like one more way you could save using an Invis pod on everyone if you wanted to do more skips, which that DPS might be worth it.
Yeah,
it also very much depends on like what kind of skips people actually want to be doing. I'm not sure, like in this current season, I don't think there are like a lot of good skips. So you probably just want to be using the Mass Barrier. But if there's like a future dungeon, future season where there's like a really good skip possible, maybe. So I don't think it's like completely useless with like 0 chance of being used in PvE. But it's definitely a talent that you won't be thinking about it a lot unless it's like some very specific situation.
Yeah.
Another point for Mass Barrier 2, and I just heard this yesterday. I haven't verified it yet. But apparently the diverted energy talent heals you for the barriers depleted on other people as well. So you could end up with like a full heal popping your Mass Barrier on your party, which is pretty awesome too. Even, for any spec.
That might be interesting.
Yeah, might need to test that one. Seems pretty good. I think also with mass invis, it's not just saving an invis pot, but there's also times where like you double invis. Remember, like in Ruby Life Pulls, we used to like pre-invis, skip the first guy, and then you do like 2 packs, and then you invis again to the boss. So it is just saving a pot sometimes, but like sometimes double invis skips can be quite good. Someone in chat said we have Shroud at home, or mass invis is Shroud at home. Sweet. Another thing we wanted to talk about was temporal warp. This is sticking around. I think I don't want to call it iconic. It's been around for a while in various different iterations, varying levels of playability, I guess, as well. But I personally find the ability to be like very, very polarizing. Like I think if you looked at the like Warcraft logs at the start of the tier and looked at like heroic logs where people are lusting on pool and killing all the bosses in 2 minutes, like Arcane was just like 20% ahead of the next spec. And then you look at mythic logs where it's like slightly different, where people aren't always lusting on pool or you're not killing bosses quickly. And then like the specs are a bit more balanced, and then like the tier goes on and you're just back to speed killing, and then like Arcane is like way, way, way at the top again. Do you think like the polarizing nature of temporal warp is like a problem long term?
I don't know if it really is, because one part about how the talent works is when you're not lusting on pull, it usually means you don't really even care about damage until later in the fight. And then that section of the fight is actually a lot shorter then. And so getting 2 lusts in that window is actually potentially a lot more damage than you'd normally get on a fight in the useful section.
Especially when that tends to also be either execute range or damage buffs on a boss or something like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
Personally, I definitely have issues with temp warp, and really the primary issue I have is how it affects haste scaling for mages in general, but specifically for Arcane, where we double stack it and we have issues with running over the GCD. Not only does it devalue external uses for like PI or even haste trinkets or berserking the troll racial, but it also kind of creates this arbitrary soft cap where the spec scales very well off haste past that point outside of lust, but because of the lust window being so potent, you end up never wanting haste. So like you end up kind of limited to this arbitrary 20% points outside of that. And it kind of, like, personally, Arcane's always felt better when it's faster to me. And it just, you can't get there right now without losing, a fair bit of DPS trying to tiptoe around that break point.
Yeah. I've also got the SimC damage curve up on my screen, and because like so much of your damage because you stack the double lust, like so much of your damage comes from that. So even if haste is like good for the other 4.5 minutes.
The issue is even worse for Frost, because you have a lot of base haste already. Like with the changes, you will be running with like 8% base haste, well 10% if you include the class talent, Then Icy Veins gives you another 20%, and you have 30% from last. That's the main reason why Frost already like staggers the last buffs. So you do not like double use it. And it has all the same issues. Like if you have more than about 20% haste, you will just be wasting it.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Fire loves it. Meanwhile, one spec just does not care about that at all.
If Fire goes over 100% haste now during combustion, it used to be you'd still get some value out of it because you'd get lots of pyroclasm procs, and those were longer casts, and so any amount of haste was good. But when you're at 100% haste, your GCD capped Scorch is just a GCD or less than a GCD, and then that actually even gets in the way of queuing things and makes it more awkward to do the rotation. which especially might be a problem with improved Scorch looking pretty strong, because it makes you want to use Scorch, where normally you'd swap it out for Fireball when you have too much haste. And when you're over 100%, it just feels very awkward to use.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it would be really frustrating on like Neltharion, where you're popping all your cooldowns and lust right at the end of the fight. You definitely want that improved Scorch uptime, and you just kind of have to throw this half-second Scorch at things and just wait around for a quarter of a second after.
Yeah,
It's
I think
also kind of interesting. One point I'd like to bring up is that temporal warp wasn't always this way. Like you had to stagger it because it gave you the same last buff. So like maybe that's a way to kind of fix it, quote unquote, in that you are forced to use it one after the other. I mean, obviously it's a nerf to the talent, but yeah, I guess you wouldn't feel so bad about haste anymore if you were actually forced to use it one after the other, like Blizzard preventing players from abusing themselves, kind of.
Yeah. One thing I was going to say about fire as well is it's okay to like say, oh, at 100% haste, all these issues happen, but if you ever, because like you have to respond to your spells hitting the boss, like if you ever like 40 yards away from the boss, or the boss is a really big hitbox, like you encounter a lot of those issues even earlier than that haste amount, which can be really awkward if you start like hard casting pyroblast. We have all the stuff with like people like jumping during combustion or strafing, and because there's all these issues happen at high haste. So do you think it would be healthier if they did something like that, or if they had like I don't know, if it was like a separate button and it was like a mini bloodlust, like 20% haste for like 20 seconds or something instead?
I mean, a solution like that would definitely be interesting and maybe welcome. But I also think just addressing time anomalies weakness as well would do a lot in that regard. Like when you have those fights where your guild is like, all right, we're lusting at 40% for no reason, because Zara gets harder at that point. The first boss of Mythic, whatever. You could just run time anomaly and not worry about losing the value that you would get from lust. But it's just the tuning around that talent just isn't there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another thing whenever we're sort of comparing I guess it's not specific to the class tree, but it doesn't belong with any particular spec, is Cold Snap versus Prismatic Barrier versus Cauterize. So I guess I'll bring up the talents again. The new talent we were talking about, Ice Cold, said it had a couple of interactions, mainly with Cryo Freeze, but this is also Cold Snappable. I'm not really sure that makes Cold Snap a huge amount better. I think a lot of the times where Cold Snap is good, it's like because you're cheesing the mechanic twice. It's like, oh, I can cheese the mechanic twice instead of once now. Like if I think about the previous tiers where I was not playing Frost, but I would have wanted Cold Snap, it would have been like Fire on N'Zoth, for example. So I could have like double immune that. Still think Cauterize is probably the best of the three, maybe Prismatic Barrier. But I think with Prismatic Barrier, your like cooldowns are so good. Like I kind of want like fuck up protection more than anything. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of asymmetric balance?
Well, so I definitely agree that Cold Snap is still going to be the worst of the three. But I think it's getting a lot of value, like maybe more than you give it credit for, especially because the reset basically now includes full heal, which is going to be good in a lot of situations. Like getting 2 full heals in like every 5 minutes instead of 1 heal every 3 minutes, something like that, is going to be valuable in a lot of places. Probably like maybe not in raids, but maybe on some fights, but in Mythicals, I can definitely see some situations where you just want to have 2 full heals in 3 minutes.
I think it would make a big difference too if Ice Cold didn't give you the hypothermia buff. Like you're not immuning, so it seems a bit redundant compared to like other classes that have a defensive refresh. They don't have that arbitrary like 30-second window on there, and it makes sense with a 10-second immunity spell, but for a 6-second wall, maybe that's not as overpowered as it's being weighted,
Yeah, that part's probably not completely necessary, although we also have greater invis that we can just use in between. And so if you do want to use 3 like walls in a row, it's definitely, the hypothermia is not going to get in the way necessarily.
Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to cauterize and prismatic barrier comparing to cold snap as well, it's interesting what you say, Toe, and I actually really agree with prismatic barrier versus cauterize, because prismatic barrier just gives us more of something we already have. We can already survive the big hits without an issue. Cauterize actually, despite the damage dot that it puts on you, it is really good rot protection overall. It gives healers an extra 3 seconds of time to deal with you after you bleed out, right? I wonder how necessary that's, or how much that's going to shine when we have ice cold with cryo freeze, because I think that kind of fills the same gap there. And so I'm interested to see how that plays out long term. But I also think a lot of that is just kind of decided on the raid, right? If the damage instances are like Razagat, your prismatic barriers goated as hell, right? But if the damage instances are like Broodkeeper, it's pretty much worthless. like you're just gonna
Yeah.
bleed out through it.
Yeah, one of the things like I've noticed like a lot of like whenever I would die in progress, it's like just getting like 100 to 0'd by somebody else messing up or myself messing up. And I'm like, okay, cool. Prismatic Barrier is really good, but I really wanted Cauterize there. You know, I think it's what you were saying. Like it's stuff you're already good at. Already good at already.
Yeah, that's also an interesting point about like because of how many defensives we now have, there might be some interesting things that you can soak, because if you stack all of them, you get like 90% damage reduction, something crazy.
Yeah, like I
Yeah,
definitely remember.
I used
You
to
go
troll
first.
people on Sludge Fist and kill them with the chain, stacking Greater Invis and Mirror Images and Prismatic Barrier.
Yeah, I remember when we were doing like week 1 Anduin, which is basically like a mythic boss on week 1, and like we were trying to figure out like, okay, who can live, because you couldn't have everybody soak at the end, so it's like, okay, which classes have enough stackable DRs that they can like live the one shot without actually getting one shot, and I think it was like just Shadow Priest and Warlock. So yeah, there's definitely kind of use cases for having an almost immunity that is not quite an immunity. Cool. Does anybody have anything else they want to talk about in the class tree?
Let me just quickly open the class tree.
There are a
There's
couple of
always drop
issues.
removal, right? Kind of
Yeah,
the
that's a good
giant
point to bring
elephant.
up, yes.
Yeah. Do we want to touch on ROP removal? I think it's very polarizing.
Yeah.
I,
Is it?
I would think so. I mean, like, I I think polarizing in terms of there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, this is really good, and then there's the other half that's like, wah, my skill cap, wah.
Yeah, I mean, so far from what I've seen, a lot of people that don't necessarily main mages are like there. Everyone like, oh, I'm coming back because Rune of Power is gone. So it was like definitely like among the broader audience, it was definitely an aspect of mages that was very badly received. So yeah, you will see a lot more people picking up mage alts, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, right? As for the people that actually still the main mage, I think that there is a bit more split, as you said, but I think it's still like more in the direction of Rune of Power removal was good, especially because the current version of Rune of Power, where like back in the day when it was like this 2 charge cooldown, and you could basically decide when you want it. That spell worked a lot better than it does right now. When you basically are forced to use it on cooldown because it doesn't have charges, and your cooldowns obviously drop a rune of power, and you are stuck with this annoying, like, I don't want to call it a feature, but it's the best word that comes to mind, where you have this 50% uptime on this buff, which basically restricts you to one place. Yeah, so this version of Rune of Power, I'm kind of glad to see gone.
Yeah. I think 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been a much more controversial change, but now I haven't seen a lot of people defending ROP anymore.
Yeah, I think with the Shadowlands changes making it easier to play, it also became like much harder to balance, like things like Icy Propulsion, where Frost Mage was really good in Season 2 Mythic Plus because you had 100% uptime on Ring of Power when you were in packs, and it's like, okay, makes the spec good, but like, I don't know how healthy this is, especially when the spec was like really struggling on single target and raids at that time. And then you have lots of cooldown reduction and fire with kindling, so I think it's a good change too. And I think Darwin made a good point. I think a couple of years ago maybe would have been different, but we are where we are now. I'm happy to see it gone. Kind of over it at this point.
I think it's healthy for the mage community in general. I think mages get a bad rap for sitting in their rune trying to maximize damage and not doing the mechanics people want them to do. And I think people saw that, and I think that's kind of what Nori's getting at a little bit with the outside mage community really hating ROP, whereas the interior mage community, you know, everybody sees like it does make the skill ceiling a lot higher. You know, how you weight that cooldown, how you utilize it. But honestly, my experience has been that the encounter design has slowly gotten more movement intense since like Legion when I came back to the game. And like there's encounters where you can drop ROP, but you're not going to get all 12 seconds out of it. Not a chance in hell, and that's never really a good feeling, right?
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. I do think there's a lot of people in Discord who are like, oh, you just drop it at a good time. And it's like, no, I'm just going to fucking slam it on cooldown and hope the boss doesn't target me with his revive mechanic. Like,
don't
like,
get a heart.
That's what
That's
I have
all
to
you gotta
do.
do.
Like, I need to press Arcane Search in another 40 seconds. Like, I need to just go now, you know. So, good change. I think do we want to? I've got the talent tree up for stream. I know we had called out flow of time is in a very difficult spot. So whenever you're kind of pathing down towards your capstones, you can really only put 1 point in it because it doesn't. You need to get to all 3 capstones because you have enough points to get to all 3 capstones, but it doesn't help you get there. So it's kind of just not fantastic.
And it also kind of only displacement as well. You have to give up a capstone if you want to get displacement. And given how much mobility mages have, I think it'll probably just get skipped most of the time.
Yeah, I can definitely see PvP passing up Ice Cold in general and just running straight block for dot removal and stuff like that. And for those people, I think flow of time and displacement is going to be a staple. But for anyone in PvE, I think it's going to be like, do you need ice block for this fight? Okay, then you can get displacement and flow of time because otherwise you just don't have the points for it. You know, there's one alternative as well where you can drop Dragon's Breath and Mythic Plus and pick it up, but like you're really another issue with displacement too is that it doesn't go off GCD when you take Shimmer anymore, like it used to in BFA and in Legion when it was an arcane only spell. And so now it's like you have to blink, then you have to use a GCD to blink back, and then you get a heal, and it's just kind of an extra step for 100k heal, and it's just not really worthwhile.
Yeah, I actually stopped using displacement on a lot of fights because I would be like, I don't know, 30 pulls in, and I'm like, yeah, I haven't pressed displacement yet. I guess I'll see what else there is in the tree. I think making it off GCD would definitely help, but yeah, it needs to kind of
especially with all the time, it's hard to kind of justify using displacement,
especially on top of
all the time works
too, right?
a lot like the displacement. Like in a lot of situations where you would need displacement are like covered by alter time. So
yeah, and it's off GCD and brings you back to your rune pretty quick, right?
Also gives you a charge of blink or shimmer.
Yeah, you can blame Porum for it coming back. We lost displacement for alter time, and then the Arcane community complained too much, so we got displacement back.
In its bastardized form, yes.
To be fair, I'm quite happy with where alter time ended up. It's a really interesting defensive cooldown.
Yeah, it's a good spell. The only other thing I think I wanted to raise was so mirror image. There are 2 talents afterwards that do something whenever mirror images dissipate. They either give you CDR and mirror image, or they heal you. So how mirror image is supposed to work is you have a DR for 40 seconds. If you take direct damage, one of the images dissipates, but like very few spells and raids actually trigger it. So then, I mean, mirror image ends up being better for it. It's like 40 seconds of 20% DR. But I also think that it's quite polarizing because there are some boss abilities that actually hit your mirror images and kill them. I know, for example, I don't know which ability specifically it is, but I think one of the abilities on Rashok kills your mirror images. And yeah, I think that the sort of polarizing nature of that is not super healthy for the game. I think it'd be much better if they kind of fix this, even if it would make the class probably worse. But yeah, someone's saying it's the Rashok soak. I found that out the hard way whenever I mirror imaged before the soak, so that whenever we cleared, I wouldn't get one shot, and then I would get one shot by the clear. I'd be like,
but you get the CDR though.
well, you don't, because you only get the CDR if the images like dissipate the damage, but if it's they don't
is
disappear.
It like a magic target or something?
No,
Yeah, they don't.
you need like if the images just die from damage, you don't get anything. They need to die because you took damage.
Yeah, so whenever Rashok does his soak mechanic, it actually kills your mirror, like it hits your mirror images and kills them. It's like, why does this work like this? So I think there's a lot of things they could do with mirror image that just make it a healthier ability, because there was examples last expansion where, like, not so much in raids but in dungeons, like boss abilities would target mirror images, and it again, it makes them good, but at the same time you have to ask like how healthy something like that is. But yeah, that's my opinion. Any other issues with the class tree before we move on?
So another thing I wanted to touch on too is Incantation of Swiftness. This is a talent that I think has been amazingly popular throughout Dragonflight so far. It gives mages a really good sprint option on a 5-minute cooldown. It's basically being completely stripped out because now invisibility is a baseline ability and is replaced when we pick up Greater Invis. The sprint still sticks with Greater Invis, but Greater Invis is such a strong defensive, you're never going to use it as a sprint unless you're solo content or something, right? And so we're kind of like losing something that I think mages have been really happy to have overall. And a 5-minute sprint isn't exactly the most, overpowered thing or anything. So it's just a little disappointing with that. It's also a little disappointing too that a lot of talents, like the mirror image ones that you brought up, just didn't really get any attention despite them having 0 pick rates and every bit of content, like improved Frost Nova, Frigid Ice, right? I'm just really surprised that those didn't get touched on at all.
Yeah, I'm a big Incantation Swiftness fan. I remember even in Shadowlands, whenever you pick the Soulbind, it had the extra finesse conduit, and you're like, well, I guess I'll throw this one in, and then you play with it, and you're like, wow, this is really, really good. So yeah, hopefully they change that.
I think it would be a lot more interesting if they made mass invisibility actually apply to you and everyone in the party. That would be interesting for skips.
Yeah,
that would be awesome.
I think it would also be cool if mass invis doesn't apply to people in combat, but if it applied like a movement speed with Incantation of Swiftness to people, like I think there's definitely applications for that. Having like a 5-man roar, I think would be kind of cool utility.
Is mass invis just 5-man, or is it?
It should be everyone, I think.
Everyone, right?
It's a whole party, yeah.
It'll be raid by terror.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so that would be even better. So it would just be like Stampeding Roar or something then. So like, I think that'd be like good utility. Obviously requires you to pick mass invis. So essentially you're picking between like mass barrier and roar, which is like, could actually be a choice, because we're talking right now about how mass invis would like never see play in raid in its current state. So yeah, could be good. Okay, do you want to jump over to Arcane?
Yeah. So obviously the changes that took place are, linked in every which Blizzard post and Wowhead post so far, but the gist of kind of the strongest parts of the change is that they removed the Arcane Power talent, which was a requisite talent after Arcane Surge and essentially freed up a point throughout the tree with its removal. Another point is they broke up Nether Tempest and Reverberate. So Reverberate got moved up the tree. And Nether Tempest is now the only option in that slot, and it's also the only way to get to Touch of the Magi and eventually Radiant Spark. So it's practically, mandated. Nothing really different from now. Reverberate is actually really strong in AoE too. They also changed the clear casting. They made that baseline as well as Arcane Barrage and bumped missiles and added a new talent, Concentrated Power, which makes Arcane Explosion echo after itself, kind of like the Legion artifact power that we got in 7.2. Combined, the Reverberate and the Concentrated Power alone, like without even going down into Orb Barrage, we are explosioning half as much as we used to in AoE. So you already get a lot more out of Arcane Barrage there. And then further down the tree at the capstone level, they completely reworked our Orb Barrage, did away with the whole missile mechanic, and turned it into Mantle of the Kirin Tor, the Legion Legendary, 10% per charge to have a chance for Arcane Barrage to throw an orb. Insanely strong in AoE and a lot of fun, honestly. This is all kind of juxtaposed, though, because they turned around and removed the cooldown off of Barrage. So now you can have 14 casts in a row that are just Arcane Barrage and nothing else, which is a little ridiculous. Especially, we're going from famine to feast here, right? In 10.1 right now in AoE, your rotation outside of cooldowns is 4 Arcane Explosions and a Barrage, and you maintain Nether Tempest outside of that. With this, you just barrage. If you don't get a proc, you throw an orb because you have 2 charges of them, and Shifting Power resets that as well. So it's like a way more fluid AoE rotation as opposed to now, but it's also it's at risk of being really degenerate as well. Outside of that, the single target stuff is no different, really. They kind of promised us in the rework that we would have an extra point to put into a utility spell. Obviously, there's too many throughput talents in the tree still because we're not ever going to do that. At least the way the tree is now. In Mythic Plus, you'll just grab an extra single target talent. In raid cleave scenarios, you'll just grab an extra single target talent. And in the single target raid build, there's enough talents in the tree to support that where you'll just don't have anything left for utilities. So it's a little unfortunate in that regard.
Yeah, I think sorry, I was just gonna say,
Sorry,
I think the idea of like freeing up talents to say like, hey, put this in a utility point is just very like ignorant, because I'm just gonna be like, no, I'm gonna put this in a throughput point. I think Arcane has what, 4 or 5 utility talents? You've got like the Norganon's
I believe
one.
5.
Yeah, which is like
Oh
obscene.
no, 6. Sorry, you also have clear casting, but that's a gate. So they actually did clear casting and presence of mind correctly. How you would want to do utility in a throughput tree, right? Where it's gating off throughput that you either want or can use, right? So like in single target, you could or in AoE rather, you could theoretically drop impetus and slipstream if you wanted, You'll probably never do that because slipstream enables Evocate to channel while moving, which is a huge quality of life issue in regardless of content. But like presence of mind, if you want Evo, you just get presence of mind. It just comes with it. Whereas the rest of the utility doesn't lead anywhere that you need to be, and so you just work around it, right? You just dance around Foresight and Chrono Shift and Supernova and Prismatic Barrier and just pretend they don't exist, which is pretty unfortunate because Supernova being available should be a really strong thing in Mythic Plus. Imp PB should be like a strong thing in raiding. Chrono Shift should be a really strong AoE and solo utility spell, and it's just they all just end up not being picked at all. It's just unfortunate.
Yeah, so like the issue, like it doesn't necessarily have to be an issue to have like some utility talent in your talents in a talent tree. Like if you take a look at the current class trees, where we still have like a lot of throughput stuff, when you are trying to fill up the second tier, you can grab all the throughput stuff pretty easily, and then you have like a lot of points to spend on the utility stuff. So there are essentially like two ways to do this. Either you are forced to take it to unlock something that you really want, as Porom said with like Presence of Mind, or you just set it up in a way where like you pick up all the throughput plans, and then you have like these like 2 or 3 points that you can just put into the utility stuff. But yeah, the current way it works with Arcane is like, yeah, you either don't have a choice because you need to pick it to get to something better, or you have enough throughput talents that you can like you do not ever have like a spare point to put somewhere.
Yeah, I think there's opportunities as well to maybe like merge some of the talents. So like, I don't know, one of the things you mentioned was like Chrono Shift. Like if you just put Chrono Shift into like Mana Adept or like Arcane Cleave or something like that. Like I think there's definitely opportunities there to just like jam talents together. Looking at the tree as well.
Also,
Oh, you go.
sorry, I think it would also make a lot of sense too if some of the, like Nori was saying, where like you go into the class tree and you pick your throughput very easily, and then you kind of have your utility that you branch out into as you steam fit. A big issue with having as much utility as Arcane has in its tree is that it's either throughput or utility. There's no grabbing your throughput and then having optional points, or even like there's just no way to dance around it without. And another point too to that as well is that the talents are all really high value percentage wise when it comes to DPS. And so you're in a lot of instances you're trading like 2-3% DPS for an ability that you probably don't need. So it's just kind of unfortunate that they stuff so much of it in the Arcane tree. I think it would make a lot more sense to just move some of it to the class tree as well. Like Frigid Ice is sitting there never getting picked by anyone for anything. Just put the Scorch movement speed and Chrono Shift in its place or something like that, right? Where it's you don't have to pick throughput or utility. You get to pick the utility you want out of an array.
Yeah, I definitely
Is
think so
Arcane
too.
the only tree the only tree that has like any utility now?
I think it's
so,
the
yeah.
I think it's the only one that has talents that are only utility.
Yeah.
Because like the reason I suggested like jamming talents together is I think like Scorch movement speed is like a Scorch movement speed and Scorch execute are like the same talent now as well.
Yeah.
Or maybe they were before. But like whenever they created the talent trees, like they put Scorch movement speed in with a damage talent to like avoid the scenario where you don't take it.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you have
The
fire.
only utility that Fire had was like Cauterize, and there is no baseline, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And originally there was like improved flame barrier or something, right? And they got rid of that. Improved
Right.
blazing barrier.
Yeah,
But obviously
I
that's
forgot that was a
blast.
thing.
It's worth noting too, though, that it is kind of a blessing and a curse as well, because as a result of having those utility talents kind of bloating out the tree, there's less differences between the single target and AoE builds. So you can kind of not have to sacrifice as much by, having 4 different single target talents that you take instead of 4 different AoE talents, right? There's all these utility talents filling out the tree that you can just avoid and get both. So
Yeah.
yeah. Looking at this tree, something that sort of caught my attention when you were talking there about Arcane's AoE kit is, do you think Arcane Harmony is kind of being left out to dry a little bit? I was kind of thinking about how, with concentrated power, they've now made clear casting interactive a little bit better with Arcane Explosion, because before, like, okay, it made it free, but like, who cares, lol. Whereas now it's echoes for extra damage, and Arcane Harmony kind of cares about clear casting, but if you're not actually casting Arcane Missiles and it doesn't, like, do you think there's maybe like, do you think there's issues sort of creeping up with Arcane Harmony? Do you think it's going to keep falling further and further behind? Like, think that needs addressed at all?
yeah, I definitely do. I think there's issues with Arcane's capstones in general. Siphon Storm and Radiant Spark and Harmonic Echo are leagues ahead of Orb Barrage, Harmony, and Cascading Power in single target. And then in AoE, uh, Siphon Storm, Orb Barrage, and Radiant Spark are leagues ahead of Harmony and Cascading Power. So like, there's no situation that you want to pick Harmony and Cascading Power outside of PvP right now. And as a result, you kind of just get pigeonholed into these other spots. And a big issue with Arcane Harmony actually isn't the talent itself, but it's also the 3 talents points that you have to spend to get to it are incredibly weak. Like concentration has bugs that actually make it a DPS loss to play in some cases. Illuminated Thoughts is 10% more chance to proc arcane missiles, which is already a very low percent chance to proc based on mana spend, and it doesn't really add anything of value beyond that. And same for Cascading Power. If you use Cascading Power on its own without already having a missile proc, the proc you get does nothing, and it's been bugged like that since they added it. And so you have these talents that are actually bugged and make it frustrating to play versus, talents that are completely overpowered by comparison. And so, yeah, I think the balance between Arcane Harmony, it slipped in 10.1, right? Where they buffed Blast a bunch, and as a result, it kind of got scaled out of things. But with these changes, especially Orb Barrage's edition, I don't think there's a scenario you take Arcane Harmony even in PvP now. So I think it's a fully dead talent at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. I actually really like barrage-based arcane builds. I think whenever Carrion Arcane popped up in Sanctum of Domination, or earlier than that, depending on who you are, I really liked because barrage, because it's your funnel spell and because it's your execute spell, like the better barrage is, like the better those things become, and they're like very good raid niches, or at least historically they have. Obviously, like execute isn't as good as it used to be. Blizzard seem to be moving fight design in a way that execute isn't like the only damage that matters. So, but there are some cases where it's still relevant. So I kind of do like barrage being like a relevant spell, or at least having the option for it to be like a very relevant spell. I think that gives like Arcane a sort of different dynamic. And yeah, you mentioned Cascading Power as well. I think the sort of mana gem side of the tree should probably get changed a bit, because like Cascading Power is giving 2 killer casting stacks. It's like, okay, you cap out at 3. If you go into your Radiant Spark, obviously we cast Arcane Surge a bit earlier now, but whenever you're in Radiant Spark, you don't want to cast Arcane Missiles, obviously, because it'll consume your stacks. And then Arcane Surge will give you Arcane Missiles clear casting proc. So it's like, if you proc another time in your Radiant Spark, which is like not unreasonable, like the talent just munches itself, and it's like,
yeah, I mean, anyone who's played Arcane this tier or last knows that by the time your Spark window's done, you've already got 3 missiles to proc 90% of the time. There's just no real place for that. It was kind of built around a version of Arcane that missiles was stronger in, right? It was kind of built for like Shadowlands Arcane or something where missiles was much more impactful on the rotation, and with Blast dealing most of our damage now and missiles being scaled back so much, it just hasn't kept pace at all.
Yeah.
It's worth noting though, like, could not be happier with the AoE changes. They're not all perfect, but it is a huge improvement. Huge props to Blizzard what they've done there.
Yeah. I know we touched on Rune of Power removal briefly, but what do you think about Rune of Power removal for Arcane?
It's a really good thing for the spec overall. A lot of the complexity that I think people are used to with Arcane is going to die down a bit because of Rop's removal. A lot of our decisions when building the APL and deciding what you want to do from action to action was built around, how do I maximize Siphon Storm and 2 Runes of Power that are back to back, right? Without that, it's really going to come down to more about some of the historic Arcane interesting things like mana spend and trying to maximize, your Evo mana pool and your Surge mana pool, which I think is a lot more interesting than Rune of Power. And in general, I think people are going to be a bit more aware of Arcane's lack of mobility issues. I think people have kind of decided that Rune of Power made all mages immobile, or maybe Arcane more in some cases for some reason. But I think that stigma is going to go down a bit without Rune of Power as well.
Yeah,
I'm definitely happy about Rune of Power's removal overall.
it's the case for all specs, but like you kind of have this idea of like, okay, well you can, if a mechanic goes in you can kind of shimmer out, but like if you just shimmer out of your rune, then it doesn't matter. Whereas now it's like super, super powerful.
Yeah, I definitely see the Rune of Power as removal as like a huge shimmer buff over Ice Flows now. I think Ice Flows is a lot weaker by comparison, actually.
Oh,
Yeah,
it must really be worse if you're saying it.
Yeah, so one thing that I actually was surprised by was like very late into the patch, they decided to remove the cooldown of Arcane Barrage. And like, I understand that they wanted to give you this adrenaline rush of getting all these Arcane Barrage procs or Barrage procs, and just spamming Arcane Barrage back to back. But honestly, I thought like it was better for the spec to have this, okay, use Arcane Barrage and you have one GC to do something else, and you can use Barrage again, instead of just this degenerate spam of, let's see how many procs can I get back to back. So it was kind of a surprise for me.
Yeah, I haven't played much on PTR, but I remember whenever I used to play it in Legion, like doing those big pulls in Lower Karazhan, and then like my Barrage procs or Mantle back then, and I'm like, I want to press Barrage, like let me do this, like so yeah, I can see the arguments to either side of that.
Yeah, like especially you have like a lot of GCDs to fill stuff with, because you have the two charges of Arcane Orb with the talents. You also have this concentrated power now. The Arcane Explosion is actually doing 40% more damage if you use it on Arcane Explosion, if you use it with clear casting proc. So I don't think like the GCDs in between are like completely dead.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't think they were dead. I think maybe there's just like a feels bad of having to press a button that isn't Barrage at 4 charges. Maybe they just want to get rid of that.
It's also a very different circumstance from Legion 2, right? Because in Legion, for example, when Mantle didn't proc on like Harjatan when the ad spawned or something in Tomb of Sargeras, you were just kind of screwed, right? You just started explosioning because Overpowered shared a talent node with Arcane Orb, so you never took Arcane Orb in Legion. Whereas now, not only do we have Arcane Orb for that bad luck protection, but we have 2 of them. And they're on a charge that we can halfway reset with shifting power on top of that. So to your point, Nori, like I don't see where you cast any other spells. Like you're just gonna cast Orb and Barrage, and if you run out of Orb charges and Arcane charges, you hit shifting power to get more Orb charges, right? Like where does Nether Tempest fit in that outside of the touch window? Where does Dragon's Breath? Where like
Yeah, I mean,
Nether's gonna want to do anything but Barrage, right?
I don't necessarily disagree, but like it still like requires some engagement on the player's part, where like, okay, I actually need to check what's happening instead of just, oh, spam Barrage.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if I recall correctly, it wasn't like all that big of a deal in terms of AoE damage, right? It was like a small buff, decently sized buff, the removal of the cooldown.
They also changed other things, right? They buffed Barrage itself, but they nerfed Resonance a bunch.
All right, yeah,
and they also nerfed Arcane Orb and Explosion. So they like did this huge monumental buff to how the spec works functionally, but then tailored back all the uncapped AoE stuff as well as the Resonance funnel, which is kind of sad as well. That's another point against Harmony, right? Is the Resonance nerf, which I forgot to mention, which is actually pretty substantial. It's like 20% nerf to the ability.
Yeah, so I suppose there is also a good point to bring up in that if you have this like super impactful 40% proc chance effect, it's gonna result in a lot of variants for the spec. Because 40% is not far from coin toss, which is like the most random event you can have. So there's definitely gonna be some feels bad when you're like, it's not completely unreasonable to see like, I don't know, 4 or 5 barrages just not proc anything. It's not that unlikely, right?
Yeah, I've seen like just running the AoE sims and working on that, I've seen iterations of the sim that hit 13 barrages in a row with no other spells used, and that's just about as degenerate as you can get. And then I've seen it fire off like 6 barrages with no proc, which is the worst thing you want to feel in a game, right? Is that 22 frostbolts, no flurry, right?
Yeah. At least we have warp now. You said something really interesting there. Whenever you were talking a while back, you said you were talking about pathing in the tree, and you were saying about how Nether Tempest leads into Touch of the Magi, because like you use those spells together. Do you think like Nether Tempest has a place in the game? Like if you're saying, oh, we don't use it in AoE, we can't multi-dot with it, the only time we ever press it really is going into Touch of the Magi. It's kind of like, is it just button bloat at this point?
The one thing Nether Tempest does bring is that it actually scales off Prodigious Savant, the mastery bonus that buffs. It says it buffs Blast and Barrage, but it also buffs Nether Tempest. As a result, Nether Tempest is kept up damage-wise with Blast, and it's still about as good as a Blast. So it's still a really good movement spell. However, I I was really disappointed when the Dragonflight talent revamp went in and they didn't change the spell functionally. I really had hopes that it would be like this multi-target dot and it would have some fit in the toolkit besides just being, okay, we use this to proc Arcane Echo during Touch of the Magi, and that's its only function, which is kind of what it's been reduced to now. Like I said, it's still a movement spell, but it I don't know anyone who's like, man, I can't wait to hit Nether Tempest. It's such a like it's just not a satisfying spell to hit, really. It's a prerequisite to what's satisfying, right? Which is the Touch of the Magi window when you see the Arcane Echo rocking out of control. Like that's gratifying, but Nether Tempest almost feels dirty to get there.
At the same time, though, if you could multi-dot it with it, would you really want to like target 5 enemies and put one up?
If
you already don't really want to press the button.
Probably not. But if it was like, it's like priority 1, delete it. Priority 2, multi-dot. It's like, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Like Nether Tempest is kind of annoying in that it's a spell that is a lot of like it's very interesting in terms of interactions, but not very interesting in terms of gameplay. As Sporum said, it has a lot of cool interactions with like the Touch of the Magi, where it throws the Arcane Echoes and everything. But the spell itself is like, okay, just get 4 charges, press it, and before you go into your cooldowns, that's it.
Honestly, I think it would make more sense if they just combined Nether Tempest and Touch of the Magi and just made it Nether Tempest, put it 1 talent below, move Touch of the Magi up 1. Then you have a potentially more diverse talent tree because you can access Touch of the Magi without having to go into Radiant Spark, which could open up, like Harmony or Barrage builds or something like that, which was something we never saw before, which was always something I kind of wanted to happen was, you missile and get your Orb Barrage procs and your Harmony procs, but that's dead now. But it would be interesting, you have Touch the Magi, and then Nether Tempest is just an affix onto it, right?
Yeah. I definitely agree with you that it interacts with a lot of things, but they're all just hidden interactions. So it's like, what's the point? I wonder if it could have like, I don't know, chance to proc clear casting every time it did damage that like scaled with the number of targets, or something that has like a gameplay noticeable.
Yeah, I mean, it would
impact.
definitely make it better, but I'm of the opinion that Arcane probably doesn't need a spell. It has a lot of other stuff going on, and they could just cut it, and the spec will work just fine without it.
Yeah, I agree. Delete it too.
Could just bring back Quickening, and then Nether Tempest has a great place, right?
Yeah, I loved Quickening. It's like, why does this rank 1 log have 60% uptime? You just look and it's like Nether Tempest, wait. Nether Tempest, wait 3 seconds. And it's like, yeah.
Engaging.
What's happened here?
That was a thing.
Yeah. Cool. Is there anything else you want to go over on the Arcane tree, or anything anybody wants to call out? Or
I think we didn't talk about the new Siphon Storm.
Oh yeah, Siphon
Okay.
Storm now buffs Evo and cuts the channel duration in half. It's definitely a good quality of life improvement. Although there is a byproduct of that, though. They removed the arcane charge from it, which has been a meme for a while in the arcane community, that it gives an arcane charge because why, right? But when you actually play arcane, like you siphon pre-pull and then you arcane blast and orb on pull, and you have your 4 charges. But now you're gonna have 3, so you're gonna have to blast again after orb, which is kind of weird, but not the worst trade-off for half channel duration on Evocate. Another point too that I wanted to mention as well is Charged Orb is a lot more available now in Cleave builds. So I think raid talents, when you go Cleave for something like Neltharion or Sarkareth, dropping a point of improved missiles to get Charged Orb is going to be completely worthwhile in those scenarios, which is going to be a really good quality of life improvement, especially when running Orb Barrage, because we talked about the variance with that. Outside of that, I think the only thing I didn't mention specifically is the improved Prismatic Barrier buff. They added 5% to the DR and 5% to the magic reduction on it, which is a small buff, but it could be enough to actually make it see gameplay, especially with mass barrier interaction.
yeah, it's a good call out too. Overall, happy with Arcane. Yeah, I think I like all the changes. Still a few more changes I'd make, but I think like overall, good shit.
Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
overall an improvement.
Absolutely. I think the only thing that I would beg for, if I could, would be Radiant Spark to be a buff instead of a debuff, just because it's a really unfortunate way how it interacts with Arcane Missiles specifically, ignoring any other spell interactions or even the queuing principles that it has, which are, obviously problematic when you get into heavy min-maxing. But just being able to cast missiles into it would be a pretty quality of life, and I think it would make the spec a lot more approachable for people as well.
Well, it will get a lot more complicated when you consider the fact that one of the things that keeps like the current Radiant Spark in check is that it only applies to one target if you had it on as a buff. It would be kind of hard to make it work on just one target, so it would be like you do Arcane Barrage and it just applies everything, including the cleave. It's a non-trivial buff you're asking for.
They would probably have to remove that 15% aura buff they gave us with this patch.
Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely annoying that it doesn't work with missiles at all.
Yeah, I think even if they just fixed that interaction, I think it would just make the spec a bit more intuitive in general. I think like one of the worst feeling things is if you have a brain fart and you hit missiles during Spark window. All right, you've just done 4K damage when you could have done 400K. It's just not a great feeling for somebody trying to like learn the spec and approach it. So
yeah, I think this also goes back to the fact that, as you mentioned, there are no real viable options to the Radiant Spark. So like you are forced to use it. Like if there was some way you could like pick some of the capstones that make a viable missiles build, might be more interesting. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. Do we want to move on to fire next?
Yep,
All right.
we can.
There's a lot of fire notes here. Where do you want to start, Dorvin? You get the free pick.
I think probably the biggest thing to talk about first is just the capstones in general in the fire tree. So one of the major changes they made with this rework was splitting SKB, Sun King's Blessing, into a choice node, so that now you have Sun King's Blessing similar to as it was before, but with Pyroclasm rolled in now as well. And then Unleashed Inferno as a talent to try to give fire mages a choice between the more sustained damage profile from Sun King's Blessing with hard casting Pyroblast, and a more bursty combustion, and they made it more frequent as well with the CDR to try to give you a less flat damage profile with much more of your damage in combustion. And it's a little hard to tell right now because of where sims are, but it seems like they might be a little off in the tuning there, where Sun King's Blessing is still a little too good. But at the same time, because the burst profiles are better, it might be the case that Unleashed Inferno is good enough in practice that you'll actually end up running it.
Yeah, is it still sitting at like 10%-ish? Maybe slightly less between the two? Or do you have a...
I don't have a more up-to-date number than that, but at least not in
Yeah.
front of me. It's
I
not
always
that
got it-
far behind, but it's also not that close right now from what I've seen.
Yeah, it's always kind of like an interesting discussion when you're looking at like sims between builds where like one might be more practical in reality, and it's like, okay, what's the loss I'm willing to give up here in terms of sim DPS, because like it happens a lot, but I think the current numbers maybe it's too much. But yeah, I really like the Sun King's Blessing changes. I think even if we do have to play Sun King's Blessing, like the lack of Rune and Pyroclasm being merged into Sun King's Blessing might mean that like it's a lot more tolerable to play than maybe it would have been in the past, which is nice. One thing I find interesting about Unleashed Inferno is that it doesn't apply to our AoE spells, which like on one hand, I think like, okay, sure, whatever. But then I look at Sun King's Blessing and Sun King's Blessing still affects Flame Strike, and I'm like, why?
Yeah,
What's going
it feels
on?
like
What's
it
going on
has to
here?
be intentional. They left Flame Strike and I think Meteor 2 off of Unleashed Inferno. But it's definitely hard to really understand why, I guess. I suppose they're trying to avoid too much burst AoE in Mythic Plus for doing huge pulls. But then you look at what some other specs can do, and I'm not sure if it's really necessary to prevent that from buffing AoE.
Yeah, my initial thought too was like, you know, if we think of like early Shadowlands Fire, where you're just doing these ridiculous pulls and Flame Strike Combustions do a bazillion damage to 40 targets. But I think with how Fire is now and with how the game is now, we're kind of far away from that, even if they were to add Flame Strike and I guess Meteor to Unleashed Inferno. Some other changes that happened in the tree, I suppose, just in case people miss it. I think you mentioned it, but there's not a huge amount of changes to the actual tree itself, but there's a lot of stuff that's been combined or like removed and made baseline. That means like you have a lot more like points to play with, so you just like get more stuff in what's like a similar tree. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, it's definitely the case. A lot of the 2-point nodes got turned into 1-point nodes, particularly Firemind and Field of Burn were somewhat mandatory 2-point nodes before that are now 1-point. And Improved Scorch was a 2-point node that was not really usable because you didn't have enough points. And now that it's only 1 point and got buffed, it's suddenly in a place where you can easily pick it up in a lot of the builds. So overall, that's very good that now that there's more points to spend, you have more ability to explore the parts of the tree that weren't really viable before.
Yeah. So here's another, since we were touching on it with Unleashed Inferno, another big change as well is Flame Strike now contributes to Hot Streak, sort of. Well, it does, but Flame Strike has a chance equal to 100% of your crit chance to build a Hot Streak, which is really nice. I think it makes the spec a lot more interactive on AoE. A lot of people say they like Ignite-based AoE, but I think what they really like is their spells contributing to Hot Streak. I think that's sort of the main driver behind people preferring Ignite.
Yeah, so the issue with Ignite-based AoE is that it is a nightmare for Blizzard to balance, so I'm not really surprised that they're trying to kill it. Because, like, you mentioned in your other videos that you always want to have a spec that does like all the damage to the priority target, and then like has the AoE via the cleave or like incidental AoE or anything, because that's the most useful form of damage that you want to be doing on in most Mythic Plus. dungeons, and Fire basically got it for free, and it, well, first of all, invalidates like third of your tree because all of these talents that actually do the AoE are useless because you're just printing Ignite. And second of all, you also have this issue with like the stat actually being kind of degenerate, where either it's okay on single target and absolutely busted on AoE, or it's okay on AoE and then absolutely useless on single target. So I think it was pretty much inevitable that they wanted to move away from this Ignite-based AoE, and yeah, it shouldn't really be a surprise that it's happening.
I think my only issue with them doing that, though, is the way they're doing it. I really wish that if they're going to move away from Ignite-based AoE, that they also change the mastery, because mastery being built around Ignite has, historically at least, kind of made mastery really strong in some cases for Fire. Whereas, before this patch hits, Fire is stacking mastery in AoE to do that cleave. After this patch, Fire's back to full on, trying to stack haste and burst because those are the only the only stats it has left that it gets any value out of. And as a result, it kind of makes gearing harder, right? You're more pigeonholed into just those two stats. It would have been nice if Mastery retained some value. And I think, Toe, maybe you had this idea when we talked before on this point, where you talked about maybe putting it into the Pyroblast dot, which I don't know if that would solve everything as far as AoE goes. At least you'd have a situation where Mastery's strong. It would also give Fire like a potential multi-dot option, or spread cleave option in that regard, which I always thought was kind of a good recommendation.
Yeah. I was thinking if you would go that route, you just slap the same dot on Flame Strike. So like, I don't know, new mastery could be like your hot streak causes Pyroblast and Flame Strike to apply a dot that deals whatever amount of damage, and then Ignite could be a separate thing, and you could tune that differently, and you wouldn't have impacts on mastery, and you could maybe add like different talents that interact with Ignite in a certain way without having to worry about, oh, what happens if someone just stacks mastery. Yeah,
It also
I
gives
just
Ignite kind of a more clear role, right? Like right now, Ignite is kind of your single target, your cleave, and your AoE. Whereas after patch, Ignite is just going to be kind of single target. Like I don't know, it just doesn't really have as firm a place in Fire's toolkit anymore, I feel.
I mean, the main issue is that you first need to start with like your Flame Strike applying Ignite actually being useful. Like you need to tune the Ignite coefficient or whatever in a way that makes Flame Strike, the Ignite from Flame Strike actually useful. And then I think this is probably the biggest issue and something that Blizzard is unwilling to do. I'm not sure if there are like actual reasons they're not they don't want to do this, but like a lot of the issues with how Ignite works is that when you spread Ignite, it copies the Ignite fully. Like the tick damage is just cloned, and you have this issue like if you spread Ignite, it's doing full damage on more than one target. And there probably should be some drop of like if you spread Ignite, the Ignites that you spread are doing some % less damage.
Like square root or something like that.
Yeah. I was thinking like some exponential decay, where you can tune it like, okay, so at some point, like let's say the 2 or 3 targets, the spread is so weak that you are better off just using Flame Strike because Flame Strike applies the Ignite at full strength to all targets or something like that.
Yeah. Instead of doing Decay, though, they decided to go with this Intensifying Flames talent, where it's just a bonus damage, essentially, if you're on 3 targets or fewer, and otherwise you don't get the bonus damage. And since your Ignite's doing less damage there, if they want Mastery to be useful on AoE, they just need to give Flame Strike some better scaling with it, like you said. One simple way to do that is Hot Streak gives you the 2 times multiplier right now on the Ignite that you get from the spells you use with it. And they could just make that slightly larger for Flame Strike. And that would at least partially solve the problem just by giving Flame Strike a little bit more scaling on AoE. And that would also devalue hard casting Flame Strikes a little bit so that you might consider using other spells sometimes on AoE to help generate your Flame Strikes or your Hot Streaks.
Yeah. Um, Sweet. Just looking at the rotational changes here. Maintenance buffs. We have a few of those right now. So I guess a quick recap on those. So we have Field of Burn, um, now affected by Phoenix Flames, which is quite nice. It means that it's pretty hard to not keep it up during combustion now. Improved Scorch is actually good, so we're kind of going down a maintenance buff and up another one. And we still have our tier set. One thing I will call out about the tier set is Phoenix Flames affecting Field of Burn, I think makes the tier set a lot easier. Like there's some situations where you can, like both Field of Burn and your tier set are getting close to dropping, and now like a Phoenix Flames refreshes both, which is kind of nice. How do you feel about Improved Scorch? Do you guys like it? Do you not like it?
I think apart from what I mentioned earlier, where it feels really awkward to press Scorch when you're over 100% haste with double time warp, apart from that, I think it feels good to play with, and more execute damage, even if they've been moving away with it in raid design, is always nice to have. And the new duration on it, it's really not that hard to keep it up 100% of the time without doing anything too complicated with how you're sequencing your spells or anything.
Yeah.
And you get the Scorch movement speed from taking it, which is very nice during execute, because when the talent wasn't good, that was definitely something I think that everyone playing Fire really missed having.
Yeah, I think it's similar to, can't remember what the Arcane talent's called, the Barrage movement speed.
The Chrono
Like
Shift, yeah.
Yeah, Chrono Shift. Like, yeah, just have this thing that you just always had with the old talents, and now with the new talents, you're like, where is this? I need it. I can't justify taking it, but I need it. So yeah, I think that's a good change.
Those are
Um,
definitely the kind of talents that make you consider dropping a couple percent of DPS to pick up, because they're just such massive quality of life increases and just make the game more fun in general, right? It's always fun to move faster.
Yeah. I think another concern with Fire that I think you had raised, Dorvin, was, so if we think about like how talent trees should be constructed, we have like the top of the tree, and we have like stuff that's integral to gameplay that you never really skip. That's just kind of like your core stuff. Like in the Fire tree, you've got like Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames and stuff. Um, it's kind of debatable that things like Critical Mass and Flame On, especially with 2 ranks, should kind of be closer towards the top of the tree. But instead, they're further down the tree, and with them being kind of weak, is there like a risk that, oh, what happens if I don't play with these talents, and then
Yeah.
gameplay kind of falls apart? And
Critical Mass in particular, on paper, it gives a lot of crit chance, so it's surprising, but crit's just so not useful for Fire because you get so much free crit from various sources that it's possible to drop one or even both points in Critical Mass for other things now in a lot of builds, and it essentially just means that you're getting fewer hot streaks while you're playing, and it's not necessarily a great feeling to be able to skip that talent and have it be numerically weak when it just makes the gameplay of the spec better. And then similarly, Flame On, the first point's really good because it reduces the cooldown of Fire Blast. But the second point, all it does is give you the third charge. It doesn't make your charges regenerate any faster or anything. And because of that, it means that as long as you're not capping your charges, if you get one extra charge at the beginning of the fight, and then throughout the rest of the fight, you get exactly the same casts of it as you would with just 2 charges, as long as you're not capping. So sometimes you'd want to pool them for combustion, but not counting that, second point doesn't really do a whole lot. And so it ends up only being worth like 1 or 2% overall damage to take that second point. And there's a lot of other options you could potentially take that would be worth more. And so those are just concerns with things that I think they position to be mandatory, but they're really not. And it could lead to some problems.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
part of the issue is that you also have Fire Rush, which basically makes the pooling not matter as much. Like the third charge could be useful if you'd actually didn't have enough Fire Blast to last you through the combustion, but with Fire Rush you just get out. so much from the cooldown that it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters to some extent that we are pulling, but obviously with the short cooldown, it's not a bit that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Whenever you're saying there about them being positioned in a spot where they should be mandatory, one thing I've always found weird about the Fire Dragon fight tree is the position of like Searing Touch and Firestarter. Like they're kind of in that like mandatory section, but it doesn't feel like they should be like mandatory talents. Like things like, Critical Mass, Flame On, Phoenix Flames, Auto Crit feel like they're like much better candidates to be in that early section of the tree, and then like things like Firestarter and Searing Touch could maybe move down a bit.
It's definitely weird
I mean-
that prior to Dragonflight, you always had to pick between Searing Touch and Firestarter, and now they're just always in almost every build. Unless you're playing like a Flame Strike build, you might not want Firestarter, but
They're really strong points too, right? Like they could almost be capstones, Searing Touch at least, right? As far as power
at
level?
least with improved Scorch, yeah. Searing Touch is definitely good. Firestarter is really good numerically, but in practice, sometimes you don't necessarily care about that first 10% of a fight, especially because it goes really quick with Bloodlust sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I could definitely see those as like a choice node later down the tree or something like that, like early capstone tier or something. It definitely always felt weird having both of them, especially Firestarter, because like you said, you get such limited value out of it most of the time. Even when you don't lust on pull, the first 10% of a boss evaporates when everybody's quiet on Discord doing their CDs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think opening up opportunities for like I don't care about phase 3 on this boss. I don't know, like you're doing Argus or Sylvanas or something, and you're like I want to move out of these, and it's like you almost don't even have the option, which is just weird for something that feels like you should be able to spec out of it.
Especially
also
juxtaposed against Flame On second point, where it's like that's something that I feel like you shouldn't have an option. Like I feel like the recharge of the Fire Blast should be the thing you don't really get a choice on. Like you should just get that.
Yeah, but there's also a point like with the first tier of the talent tree, like you have 10 points there and you only to spend 8. So I'm not sure like even if putting them into that first tier would actually solve this. If they were weak enough and you could avoid passing through them, you might still do that because you
for
only need
sure.
8 points.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think honestly, I'm more desperate to get Firestarter and Searing Touch out of that section than I am to get something else into it. But I think
Yeah.
I've always thought like Alex Strauss's Fury would be like a good candidate for that section. Like I think it's like night and day between Phoenix Flames auto crit and not. I think that spell feels really bad when it doesn't auto crit in comparison, especially with something like Sun King's Blessing. But yeah.
So there one actually a question. Because the flame on it has like majority, like it has a big part of the effect just hidden in the first rank, and the second rank is just doing another charge. Would it be enough if you just had like 1 second reduction, 2 second reduction, split into ranks?
I think it probably would be, yeah. Like for all talents, generally, the second point is always a little bit worse than the first one, just because they're like half the value in the first point and half in the second, and multiplicatively the first point's is better, but it would probably be enough, yeah.
It's interesting because Critical Mass actually has the opposite, right? You get 7% for the first rank, and then you get 8% for the second. So it's actually the second point's a little stronger, but we still drop it just because it's kind of a weak talent in general because of what you talked about before, us getting enough crits.
Yeah, critical mass is like one of those things that should probably be baseline or like that you just cannot pass through.
Yeah, or just like a
avoid
1 point
passing through.
talent would probably work as well.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's even a world where they remove it and crit is actually a semi-useful stat for fire, who knows?
I mean, I don't think they can really afford to remove it because otherwise the spec is gonna start to feel very bad.
Feel very bad, yeah.
Yeah.
Back to Naxxrama's fire, right? Where you just don't crit for an hour.
Yeah. Speaking of the second point in Flame On, Darwin, I know that you made this discovery, so I'll let you talk about it. Right now, we're taking the second point in Flame On so that we can go into Living Bomb. Never cast it. Get
Yeah, just so that
another
you can
Living
get
Bomb talent
Firefall.
so that we can get down to Firefall. Yeah, this talent, I guess, is pretty problematic right now. I think you're saying it's like stronger. Is it stronger than the other capstones that other than like the middle two, that is?
It's definitely stronger than like Meteor and Hyperthermia, because those talents just see, at least on single target, those two are very undertuned right now. Meteor maybe intentionally isn't great on single target, but Hyperthermia is like, for a Sun King's Blessing build in particular, because it can't proc in combustion anymore, is looking like less than 2% DPS probably for that capstone, compared to Firefall giving you almost 5%. And so even though you have to spend the 3 points to get to Firefall, it ends up being, like, on average for those 3 points, better than getting things like Hyperthermia or a lot of the other talents in this capstone section that just aren't very good right now. As
Yeah.
essentially the only capstones that are super good are the ones in the middle. So Kindling, Fiery Rush, and SKB or Unleash Inferno are great. And you have to path to Sun King's Blessing or Unleash Inferno, so you take Wildfire usually. And the only other good capstone tier talents are Fevered Incantation, Conflagration, and Firefall. And so you can easily get all of those by just pathing through Living Bomb. And that's potentially a problem because it feels like decent to skip the weak stuff, but it probably shouldn't be weak.
Yeah. I was actually quite surprised that they made the change to make Hyperthermia not proc in combustion. I think the change to make it proc on like Consuming Hot Streak is good, but yeah. Do you think this would be better if it gave you combustion, like for 6 seconds? So like if you were in combustion and Hyperthermia procs, you just get 6 seconds of combustion.
I mean, it would probably be a better talent, yeah, for sure. But in general, just it being RPPM and tied to Hot Streak makes it, like, there's a lot of periods where you go a long time without, not a long time, but long enough without a Hot Streak that it ends up not numerically being that good. Like, even though it doesn't show it in game, Wowhead and third-party tools will claim it's 1.66 procs per minute, and it's generally a lot lower than that, just because of how the math works out.
Is
Yeah,
that
so
accounting?
essentially, like the issue is with RPPM effects is that if you're not triggering them often enough, they will not have the stated RPPM, like the procs per minute. So the current number is you need to proc it at least every 3.5 seconds, and if you're not procking it or like trying to trigger it every 3.5 seconds, the overall proc rate is gonna go down compared to what it should be doing. So like if you are consuming hot streak every 7 seconds instead of 3.5 seconds, it will have half the ppm. So instead of 1.6, you will be seeing 0.8 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Something I was thinking, what do you think if we had like Sun King's Blessing, Unleash Inferno, and like Kindling as like the 3 capstones? Do you think that'd be better? I always thought like
Maybe.
Sun King. Yeah. I've always liked the idea
It's
of like
definitely
choosing between
hard
Sun King's
when you
Blessing
have,
and Kindling.
yeah, I was going to say it's definitely hard when you have Sun King's Blessing available with anything that makes combustion stronger, like Unleashed Inferno, where you can take both, because then it just makes Sun King's Blessing all the more mandatory because you're getting more combustion uptime, which is sort of what happened in Dragonflight Season 1, where the other builds just didn't exist because Sun King's Blessing gave you more combustion, which was just so much better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like the one thing that I think makes sense about this new capstone is actually having the choice between Sun King's Blessings and Unleash Inferno. Like Unleash Inferno is a very powerful talent. It's just that they buffed Sun King's Blessings by merging it with Pyroclasm by a ton. So I think like it's more of an issue with like the other capstones just not being great rather than us needing new capstones. Like the meteor stuff could be good if they actually do it properly, like taking deep impact for 20% damage at the cost of split AoE and a capstone talent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I I think looking at this tree, like if you just made Meteor work how it used to work and just put like Firefall as the capstone, it seems like don't want to say easy fix there, but it seems like it's a fix that probably makes sense. Still not sure what to do with hypothermia, to be honest, but
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
the first thing they could start by is just not having it as RPPM and just having like as a flat proc chance on every health streak you use. That would definitely make the talent much easier to tune. Like if it was, I don't know, 5% or something, you wouldn't have to be dealing with this. Oh, I'm not generating enough hot streaks. You just
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think right now when you're at your like 3.5 second cap, it's somewhere around 9%, I want to say, to proc. So if they made it like 10% or something, it would be at least a little better, and you wouldn't have to deal with that issue, and they could go from there.
yeah. Yeah, I think it was up to me.
There's
I'd
also
probably
the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, if we were talking about maybe moving Firefall into the end of Meteor spot, maybe like if Kindling moved into the hypothermia spot, because that like middle bit's kind of crowded already. Like I don't know if that makes a better tree. Kind of just brainstorming, but
Yeah. Oh, other thing I didn't mention about Firefall that's weird, because I was talking about how good it is on single target, is it's actually over on this AoE side of the tree, where you have to take AoE stuff to get to it, but then Flame Strike doesn't even contribute to Firefall, and so you're forced to use single target spells to proc it. And so even though it's good right now, just because of how it's tuned, it feels very out of place with where it is right now.
yeah, I think that's a really good piece of feedback.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted to mention is that if you compare the two capstones, hypothermia and deep impact, the one thing that also goes against hypothermia is that you have to invest more points into it to get it, because it is gated by a 2-pointer, whereas on the other side it is gated by just a 1-pointer. It's kind of weird, to be honest.
Yeah.
I really
it's
wonder,
kinda weird.
you know, we were talking earlier about the fire starter value as well that you get. It's very minimal generally. If you drop fire starter in that same kind of firefall build right now, you can pick up meteor, and if you really wanted, you could drop crit mass and pick up deep impact as well. So I wonder how, like, if you're not getting that fire starter value, I wonder how that does compare eventually, and it might end up being a lot of meatballs falling from the sky. Could be kind of fun.
Yeah, it would definitely be a potential option, especially with like an Unleashed Inferno build if they added Meteor onto that or something, or you'd want to use Combustion on Pull anyway, even if you had Firestarter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always that combustion fill even with fire starter has always been kind of a really strange one. I think yeah, I was just looking at the tree here. I know I don't have it up on Discord, but I'm on stream. I think there are some just what we were talking about earlier, like good options where you do drop fire starter and get like a reasonably satisfying result out of it. Can't drop them both, but I guess you wouldn't probably very, very rarely want to drop them both. So I think that's good.
Also, one thing I wanted to mention is that it's kind of weird that Unleashed Inferno has the cooldown reduction bit. Because like the whole point is that you have this option between Sun King's Blessing, which is higher combustion uptime, and Unleashed Inferno, which is make your combustion better. But this Unleashed Inferno also has the make your combustion uptime higher. Which I mean, I guess they had to find a way to make the talent better by not just doing something like 100% increased damage. But
Yeah.
it is a weird, it is somewhat weird that they chose this way.
Yeah, longer duration or something might be better than
Yeah.
reduced cooldown.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in my fire video, like if you're going to buff this talent, like don't buff the CDR, like buff like anything else about it, but I don't buff the CDR. Yeah, especially with kindling. I think last time I checked, like the CDR action or the cooldown of combustion actually ends up pretty similar between the two builds, because like Sunny's Blessing just has higher combustion uptime anyway, which is more kindling, so like it's kind of the very similar result.
What is the value of Unleashed Inferno right now? It has to be kind of like in high tens or something, right? Like if you compare DPS of a like without Unleash Inferno and with Unleash Inferno, how big of a gain is the talent?
I'm unsure. I just know that it's a little less than 10% behind
Okay.
the Sun King's Blessing builds, and that
Right.
it's both talents are worth a lot of DPS among like the higher talents in the tree.
Yeah, because like on paper, Unleash Inferno seems like a beast of a talent. It's just that Sun King's Blessing also got merged with Pyroclasm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember whenever the tree first went live, and I was like, fuck yes, no more Sun King's Blessing, this talent's busted. And then someone's like, yeah, this talent's actually 10% behind Sun King's Blessing. I was just like, what? Like, yeah.
Yeah, on face it doesn't read like it would be as far behind as it is, but like Nori keeps saying, like the pyroclasm merging really buffs Sun King a tremendous amount. I think the most interesting thing is when the initial sim started coming out for it is just the DPS profile, like the image of when you do your damage, with you could almost overlay UI and an SKB and have almost the same damage profile, like the same peaks and valleys were happening at the same timings, which is I mean, it makes sense, right? When you think about it, because you combust, you get an SKB proc that you get the damage bump from Pyroclasm built in, versus UI, where your bust is just naturally stronger. And so they kind of end up doing the same thing, which is really not what I wanted to see out of UI at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Obviously, like UI's in a smaller window, but I don't know if that's always going to be enough.
Yeah, so like
I mean, for a fight like Sarkareth, right? Like UI could definitely have its moment, right? Where you come up from downstairs, you do your damage, and then you go back downstairs with a bomb or something like that.
Yeah.
But like, you just play Arcane in that scenario, right? Because it's doing it better, and UI is not doing it significantly better than SKB.
Or but then if you come up with that Giga Haste buff and then you just like have Sun King's Blessing and then you get like two Sun King's Blessings like extensions worth on the same combustion, and it's like
Yeah, it might just end up being a neutral experience either way.
Yeah, I think probably need to change. I think UI needs a bit more help. I don't want to say just like buff the damage on it again, but I think buffing the
well, I mean, I'm more of the opinion that it's probably the Sun King's Blessing that should see a change, because like I completely understand that they were trying to actually make the hardcasting feel better by actually having the actual spell that triggers your combustion do something additional, something on top. But I'm not sure they actually had to just take the full 300% buff from Pyroclasm and just put it onto SKB, right? That was kind of unnecessary, I think.
Yeah, that could probably be a much lower number and still be an amazing talent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you buff UI up to SKB, like Deep Impact and Hyperthermia just aren't keeping up even remotely anymore.
Yeah, that is fair, but I also think, like we touched on it before, like the AoE spells not being on UI just doesn't make a huge amount of sense, I think, with how the spec is right now.
Yeah, I'm also surprised because like when I first started on it, I was like, okay, they're just putting Rune of Power back into combustion, right? Which is what it looks like, but it's not on some spells that it probably should have been on.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said,
someone in chat bringing up the glory days of Living Bomb, something that I think we all think of fondly when we think of Legion. Ashara, what was it? The crab pool.
Yeah.
It's definitely sad that Living Bomb has been like kind of off the menu for so long.
It's kind of weird, right? Because this spell literally just does damage. So if the spell's not good enough, like it feels like you just have to buff the damage until like it is good enough. Like it doesn't do anything else.
It still feels like it's tuned as if it had the quadratic scaling with number of targets, even though it no longer does.
Yeah, isn't it like a max of 4 targets? Or
I thought
the bombs themselves do, I believe, like square root reduction.
Yeah, they do square root reduction. So they do damage to everything around them, but the damage per target gets lower as it hits more targets. One thing is that there's also the issue with like, it's the issue that Frost had for a long time until they finally fixed it, but spoiler we'll get to that. In that it doesn't like benefit from mastery, and if you're stacking mastery,
Mhm.
the spell just doesn't get anything from it.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about Living Bomb is it's kind of weird, but if they were worried about like big M plus pulls, which they seem to be permanently terrified of, like you could buff that, you could like really lean into buffing like the dot damage on Living Bomb, and that way like it would scale to have like a linear scaling with a number of targets, and you don't
Yep.
have to worry about all the quadratic nonsense. So like that is an option as well with the spell if they're really worried about it. Cool. Anything else on fire?
I think it's worth noting the damage trade-off between single target builds and AoE builds with fire. Um, I'm not sure how much you guys have looked at that, but when things were first starting to populate, I looked around at like what the differences were, and I think I had fire simming at like 110k or something in the AoE build. It was really dramatically impacted by picking up the flame strike talents.
Yeah.
That actually reminded me the one other thing that feels kind of weird about the new Intensifying Flames talent is that if there's just incidental cleave on a boss fight where all you care about is the boss damage and there's more than 3 total targets, you're just doing a few percent less damage because you're not getting that bonus ignite damage anymore on the primary target. I'm not sure if there's really a great fix to that with how they've designed the talent, but it's one thing that will make fire not as good on bosses like that going forward.
They can make it just always do full damage to the primary target or something. I know
How
it
do you know
probably.
what the primary target is?
Yeah, how do you
That's true.
identify the primary target? Maybe it should be
That
like
is true.
if you hit a target with a single target spell, it applies some debuff which increases ignite damage.
Or
Something
your
like
most
that.
recent ignite
Yeah.
tick applied or whatever. I think probably fervent flickering makes up for that kind of scenario, right?
It might, but
Yeah.
at least
I
a little
wouldn't be
bit.
so sure.
Intensifying Flames is only like I think 3% or so damage on single target, but
it's
I'm not
not
sure if
very-
you get that much from.
Yeah, I think this is
I-
like again one of those talents that should be in the unskippable position. Like, okay, so we just want, if you are doing ignite on low target counts, your mastery is better. It should not be like optional talent. It should just be part of the spec, right, or something that you can skip.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would still be a loss because I think if Intensifying Flames is 3%, I think Fervent Flickering was like between like 0.7 and like just over 1 per target added last time I checked. So I think it would still be a loss when another target came along. I'm guessing you guys already talked about that because whenever I said the primary target, you both said, "How do you know what the primary target is?" at the same time. Kind of funny.
Yeah. I think it's partly just we're thinking about how we'd implement it in Simulation Craft and like without testing it in game, and there's not really a solution that makes a ton of sense for what the primary target would be.
Yeah.
You could probably do something like drag where the ignite originated from when it spreads, but that doesn't sound like that sounds like pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, what I was going to say.
It sounds like they're putting a lot of floor functions in the game with that one. I'm good.
Yeah, Porb, I was going to say, you said about like difference in whenever you spec like AoE and single target builds and how that affects like the other one. I think mages were pretty lucky. Fire basically took no loss. And Frost had like really good balanced builds last season. But whenever you look at other classes, I think a lot of other classes haven't been in those boats. Maybe like the super meta ones, but I think maybe mage specs are being brought a bit more online with other specs in that regard. So I think even maybe if it looks bad compared to previous iterations of mage specs, like I think in the grand scheme, it might be okay. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be so sure about Frost in that okay, yeah, it had a really balanced build, but the AoE wasn't that all that great.
Yeah, in like Sims maybe, but like your priority target damage was really good. Like you could pick, yeah, like if you avoided like Snowstorm Frostbite, and then took like the rest of the AoE talents. Like it was pretty good.
It was okay enough. It's just
Yeah.
that you weren't like beating anyone who took like your AoE talents.
I admit
Yeah.
that's definitely something I think Fire and Frost got hit with harder in that regard, with as far as losing more from grabbing your AoE kit than Arcane. I think Arcane really came out ahead in that fight. I was really expecting it to go worse because in season one, Arcane's single target AoE practically had a Venn diagram that was just a circle. And so there was like two talents he switched, right? And they were very minimal impact talents from your single target toolkit to get your full AoE toolkit. Um, and now it's not much different. So I for that reason, I'm really thinking that Arcane actually has a good shot, along with the mass barrier stuff, of being kind of a premier dungeoneering spec. Um, Whereas Fire, I'm actually a little bit more worried about, which is weird because Fire's been kind of on top of dungeoneering for so long for mages that it's weird to think that like if I'm sitting there spamming Flame Strike and I'm going to go to that boss and do 100k DPS on it, and it's just not going to, it's not going to be as fun. But Fire still has the uncapped advantage, obviously. But it's just, I definitely wonder how that's all going to play out when it's all said and done.
Yeah. I think being behind an AoE or being behind in one thing is fine if you make it up in the other. Like I think on the Frost example, like yeah, if you're 15% behind an AoE but 20% ahead in single target, like in dungeons, it's still probably like a time save. People like doing their big overalls at the end of the dungeon, but
Yeah, I mean, we see that with Fire right now, right? Even though the single target's tuned a little bit lower in the current patch, they're still dominant in dungeons because their AoE is so far ahead uh in the big pools that kind of time save, right? So you can afford to spend more time on bosses.
yeah. Okay. Now are we done with fire?
No, I've got nothing.
Oh, I forgot I'm on team delete from the ashes, but I think that's quite minor.
Oh, it's probably worth noting to did they changed nothing with Tempered Flames, right? It's still the same
Yep.
Yeah.
unchanged talent that nobody picked in the first season. I'm really surprised that Tempered Flames didn't get any adjustment because it was one of the talents added in Dragonflight to Fire, where I was like, this could actually, bring up some new build or new style of gameplay, and instead it's just kind of like time anomalies sat in the Arcane tree for years. It's just gonna sit in the Fire tree for years, it feels like.
Yeah, I just forgot the talent existed.
Yeah.
I think
It's one of
that
those things that's
We
not
all
like
did.
that bad necessarily. So maybe it'll see use at some point. But I
yeah.
also don't see it as like an urgent problem in the tree that a choice node that isn't necessarily great exists.
Yeah.
For sure, for sure. It's just there was just a lot of discussion around it initially when Dragonflight talents were released.
Yeah.
So on to Frost, guys.
Sweet. Right. Nora, you get to choose where we start.
All right. Well, I'll start from the beginning. So I think like the biggest change, or like the change that will have the most impact on, well, there are two changes, but let's go over them. So the first one is that we got a fairly major ice events updates. So first of all, we lost icy propulsion, so that means that you can no longer reduce the cooldown of ice events by just hitting stuff. That was compensated by reducing the cooldown of ice events to 2 minutes. So this is a big change because right now you basically have infinite uptime on ice events, like 100% uptime on ice events, because the cooldown reduction is strong enough for you to get the cooldown back up before it runs out. So you are always in ice events, and I know that some people like it, but this is really unhealthy for the actually like usability of Frost, especially in raids, because whenever there is a downtime, you're not getting your cooldown reduction. Your ice event is not a 1 minute cooldown, but it's a 2 minute cooldown, right? And it has a lot of other issues with how we approach fights and everything. So we are getting more like an actual cooldown that you use, you do more damage, then it expires and you do normal damage. Obviously, the one thing that Icy Veins, like the removal of this Icy Proportion talent is gonna impact is that a lot of people got used to the permanent haste that you had. Obviously, like when you are used to having 30% of haste all the time, the spec is gonna feel a lot slower when you are not in Icy Veins all the time. So I think like the solution that Blizzard actually came up with is kind of okay, in that they removed some of the haste from Icy Veins. It's down to 20% now. But they gave us a new passive, like a talent that you can pick, that everyone will pick basically, that it gives 8% haste. So if you activate Icy Veins, you will more or less have the same haste as you had before. But outside of Icy Veins, you just got free 8% haste, which is kind of nice. The second, another change with Icy Veins is that it now does, it summons Water Elemental. So first of all, the talent Summon Water Elemental is just gone. And now we get the pet when we activate Icy Veins. And like the pet itself wouldn't actually do all that much. Like the damage, even though they buff the damage by like 70% or something crazy, is the pet is still not doing anything really. So the way they solve it is they added a new buff, like when your pet hits whatever with Water Bolt, with Water Jet, it gives you a stacking damage buff, which increases your damage of your spells by 15% on maximum stacks. So basically, Ice Fence is becoming, I don't know what to call it, like a proper cooldown, because it is still like 20% haste plus 15% damage is like 35% damage-ish. So it's not like a big cooldown like, I don't know, Combustion would be, or maybe Arcane Surge. Even though Arcane Surge is very close, but it also gives you the mana regen, obviously. But yeah, it is more defined in that you have this actual window in which you are doing more damage. So yeah, let's just say that first is getting cooldown. Obviously, the Water Metal also has this additional abilities that will improve whatever you do. Like you are getting Water Jets, which means you are getting more Brain Freezes. So there is actual difference in the gameplay that you are provided by Ice Events. Instead of just having more haste, you will see more procs. You have this ability to freeze your targets with the Pet Freeze. So overall, I think that's a good change and an interesting way to actually address the issue with Water Elemental just being useless. It is a talent that has existed. Like, I mean, we had it since TBC, Summon Water Elemental, like when it was 3-minute cooldown with 45-second duration. But ever since like Legion, the talent basically stopped existing because no one picked it. There was a brief period of time where you actually picked it in BFA for the Glacial Spike thing, but you picked that because you did not want Lonely Winter, because Lonely Winter doesn't buff Glacial Spike. That was the main reason why you played Pet. And now we are actually going to be using Pet. Well, I mean, we are forced to use it, essentially. But I think it's a good change overall. I'm not sure if anyone wants to add something before I move to another point.
Does the freeze work on does the freeze give you stacks of the frigid buff?
Yes, it does. So if you hit a target that can be frozen, it will give you 5 stacks.
Wicked. Get those keybinds. Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
personally,
I
I'm really
already
glad.
had a. I still have my pet keybinds from BFA, so I'm just gonna be using those again. But yeah, I mean, Water Jet you can probably just leave on autocast because you just want to get as many uses as possible, and you will just like autocast and just track the cooldown, so you know that it's coming up. I better use my Brain Freeze or something like that. But it's essentially for most people, almost everyone, it's not a button you have to care about. Pet Freeze is like if you're doing Mythic Plus, is something that you will definitely have to bind. That's a decent enough deal that you need to actually be using it.
Yeah, I
I'm
think the only
personally
thing I'd
really
add
looking
is
forward to that is having freeze back with Comet Storm. I always really enjoyed that feedback in early BFA, especially. It was really fun.
yeah, it's super good. I think the only thing I'd add is that Winter's Blessing almost feels like a self-created problem. Like back
Yeah.
in BFA, like we didn't need Winter's Blessing back then. I don't think we need it now, but I think that people are just too
Yeah, I mean,
used to it.
if it was up to me, I would just we just know Winter's Blessing. Just if you think the Frost needs faster cast, just make them faster. You don't need like a ton of baseline haste to make this work. But yeah, I guess people are just not gonna be really happy about losing all that haste they grew so accustomed to. So whatever. Yeah, I definitely agree. It is a self-created problem, and whatever. It's not big enough
is what
issue
it
for
is,
me
yeah.
to actually. Okay,
Yeah.
and the second big change is that we are actually going to be playing with some active talents. So right now, every single viable build for Frost is essentially just using Frostbolt, Flurry, Icelands, and that's it. Sometimes you obviously have 1 minute cooldown in Frozen Orb, but all of the active talents in the tree, Ebon Bolt, Glacial Spike, Comet Storm, Ray of Frost, Summon Word Elemental, just dead talents, completely useless. In fact, for Glacial Spike, if you just pick the talent and not even use it, you lose like 10% of your DPS. So, and if you use it, you only lose like, I don't know, 9%. So it's completely laughable. So what they actually did a couple of things to make us use these active talents. Obviously, they buffed them. That is the first step. And they added some more interactions with the spec. So Glacial Spike now also extends Icy Veins with Thermal Void. Ray of Frost got a new talent, which makes your Ice Lances, like your Fingers of Frost, buff it. They added I'll change a talent to make Command Storm give you a damage debuff for targets. And the biggest change probably is the mastery change. So this is something that we've talked about a lot over the past couple of years, and it's been an issue ever since. Is that if you have your mastery, which is just the icicles essentially, if they only proc from Frostbolt, Flurry, and now Icelands, it means that whatever spell doesn't proc the icicles is just going to be left in the dust. Because especially if the stat is good, if we like mastery, it just means that these spells are getting progressively worse and worse compared to other spells. So a major change is that mastery now has 2 additional effects, or I suppose they replace one effect with another and then added a new one. In that for every point of mastery, which is like 180 rating, I believe, you get less than 1% damage increase on your single target active talents. It does include Icelands. Icelands, Ray of Frost, and Glacial Spike. And then you get slightly over 1% per point on Comet Storm, Frozen Orb, and Blizzard. So essentially, Mastery now affects most of your spells. Obviously, it doesn't affect everything, like Ice Nova is left out. But that's not a big deal, right? So for most people, it basically means that these active talents got additional 25% buff with their mastery. And it means that as you gain more and more mastery, these spells are not just going to be completely useless, which is a nice thing. So, yeah. We're going to be playing, essentially, I think it's like 2 more buttons. You are losing Rune of Power button, but you are gaining Glacial Spike, Ray of Frost, and Comet Storm. Ray of Frost is, it is technically a button, but it's a 1 minute cooldown, so it's not like a big deal. The real rotational spell you are gaining is Glacial Spike, so you will have to learn how to play with Glacial Spike. Which, it's still like not super clear what the actual optimal rotation with Glacial Spike is going to be, but the gist is that you're just going to be using it with Flurry to shatter it, to get the increased crit chance, to get the crit damage and everything. And yeah, that's definitely a change that most people will notice, is that if you want to be competitive in a raid or anything, you will be playing with a lot more buttons. Which, for me, I think it's a good change because Frost was essentially this 3-button spec, which felt kind of boring at times. So I'm overall pretty happy with these changes.
Do you think they were right to kill Ebon Bolt instead of another spell? I think they were right to kill a spell. I probably would have killed something
Yeah.
else.
Ebon Bolt, I think, was the right choice.
Ooh, I would have killed
Especially
Ray.
if they weren't going to make it faster.
Yeah, I'm thinking if they killed Ray, you'd basically be playing like early BFA Frost, where you had like Comet Storm, Glacial Spike, Ebon Bolt, which I quite liked. I thought it was like a good version of the spec, but lots of people in chat saying they'd kill Ray.
I mean, like Ebon Bolt is kind of the issue is that this spell has been kind of crappy for a long time, and they had a lot of issues that they didn't want to fix or they were unable to fix or something like that. And I really wouldn't want to be playing with Ebon Bolt if they never fix those bugs. And I was kind of afraid they wouldn't fix those bugs, because one of the issues right now with Ebon Bolt is that it is like the projectile speed is snail space. So if you do Ebon Bolt Flurry, like use the flurry you get, or like use the brain freeze you get from Ebon Bolt, it will arrive so late it will eat one of your stacks that is meant for like the Icelands after or something like that. And that's probably my main worry, is that if they kept Ebon Bolt and nuked Ray of Frost, you will still have to play around these issues. So yeah, I think assuming they wouldn't fix those bugs, Ebon Bolt was the right choice.
Yeah, I guess that's it's an interesting assumption with Blizzard. Like, are they actually going to fix these bugs? Some bugs stick around for a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
I think
we've been talking about those bugs for like ever since they were introduced, and they changed nothing. So yeah,
I think spells like Ray of Frost, where they've technically been around for a long time, but like haven't really, are in a really weird spot when they become playable. Like I've been playing Mage since Legion pre-patch, and like I don't know if I've ever cast Ray of Frost. You know, so it's going to be weird. It's kind of like a new spell where it's like, I don't know, Ebon Bolt just has that kind of
right.
familiar feeling of like, you know, this is
I
something
mean,
I've
I
used
think
before.
like if you are comparing it to the Legion Ray of Frost, Legion Ray of Frost was just horrible in terms of gameplay. It has interesting interactions. It's like the same issue with Nerd Tempest. It has interesting interactions, but not interesting gameplay, where you just press the button and then you wait 10 seconds to do damage. The new Ray of Frost is actually quite good, I would say, especially after they changed Winter's Chill to basically be this 6-second debuff that is that you can have on a target for a long time and just fully channel the Ray into it. That is actually quite satisfying when you get the full shatter and the increased crit damage and everything on the full channel. You just do like Flurry, Icelands, Ray of Frost. It actually feels kind of nice. So I think in terms of the gameplay, I like it more than Ebon Bolt, where Ebon Bolt is basically just a copy of Frostbolt that guarantees the brain freeze proc. There's no other gameplay there really. With Rare Frost, there is something more interesting, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All
Speaking
right.
of brain freeze, Fingers of Frost, munching problems, things that look like they're probably still sticking around.
Yeah, so this is kind of annoying in that I absolutely agree that Frost is kind of at the point right now in the live version of the game where we are swamped with procs, especially with like freezing winds and everything. Sometimes you feel like you cannot use your procs before you get more of them, and that doesn't feel great. This is like the other kind of munching. Obviously, Frost has this issue where you use Brave Freeze, and then if you use Icelands, it will use Winter's Chill, but it will also use your Fingers of Frost. That's like issue number one. Issue number two is that sometimes you just cannot cast the spells fast enough to actually use up your procs. So Blizzard is actually doing something about this other issue, the second issue, where sometimes you're getting too many procs. But I'm not sure I agree with the way they are doing it, because they are nerfing the base brain freeze proc chance from 30% to 25%. and with the talents it's gonna be like from 36 to 30%. But the issue is that Frost doesn't really have a lot more going on than just brain freeze. Fingers of Frost is kind of like this proc that is always available, so it doesn't really feel like a proc, right? Brain freeze is the thing you are actually looking forward to, and 30% is kind of getting to the area where you get the feast and famine kind of stuff. Like you can get fairly lengthy periods of time where you just get no procs. No brain freeze procs, I should mention, because the Fingers of Frost procs are like not really procs at all. So I
Do you think
wasn't
that's a
really
problem though? Like there's been versions of Frost where I feel like I've played where like Fingers of Frost has been a real proc. And like I feel like in Legion, Brain Freeze was always the better one, but like it was a lot closer in terms of the
definitely.
two.
I mean, this is basically just caused by the fact that they made double Icelands the default by changing Mythostra to just always give 2 stacks. And I mean, I kind of understand why they did it, but the end effect is that you essentially have this proc which is like more than twice as powerful as the other one. I think it's probably like 3 times more powerful. And yeah, it doesn't feel good getting Fingers of Frost compared to Brain Freeze. And in Legion, you actually, it wasn't the case, right? If you got Brain Freeze proc, it was nice. If you got Fingers of Frost, it was nice. They both felt reasonably powerful. It doesn't really do that.
Yeah, I think now the only time that Fingers of Frost really feels good is with 2 targets and splitting ice, because you get value on both. And then, but unfortunately in this game, single target's just very important. And yeah.
I take it like a single or a simple like Ice Lance buff isn't going to solve that, because obviously Ice Lance is a spell you cast into Brain Freeze, so
I mean, that's a problem, because if you buff Icelands, it also means you're buffing the Icelands that you cast into Winterspell after Flurry. So you are buffing Flurry even more, Brain Freeze even more. Yeah, so the disparity between these procs is not like due to the damage the spells are doing, because you are still using Icelands in both cases. It's just that you have one proc which is Icelands, and you have another proc which is Flurry and 2 Icelands. So like, yeah, obviously the second one is going to be better.
Yeah.
There's also something clean about the design where both of them just make you treat the target as if it was frozen. So just giving like a damage buff on Fingers of Frost could work, but wouldn't really, the design wouldn't feel as clean anymore if they did that.
Yeah, that's like actually like there used to be a time where Fingers of Frost had this like a huge buff to the Iceland's damage, and I never found it like satisfying. Because like this, especially because you also use Icelands when the targets are frozen in other ways, like in open world or anywhere, like you freeze the target with Frost Node and you can use Icelands. It always felt bad, like having this, okay, so I can actually now use my freeze to actually do some damage, and the Icelands just doesn't do any damage because it doesn't work unless you have Fingers of Frost. Like, it doesn't do damage unless you have Fingers of Frost. So I do kind of like the fact that Iceland's Fingers of Frost doesn't have this huge buff to Iceland's damage, but yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, Nori, about the balance between Frostbolt damage and proc damage right now? Because I mean, we've kind of gone back and forth on that over the years, right? In Shadowlands, Frostbolt was a lot more proportional damage than it is now. Do you think that was maybe a better way of dealing with like proc variants? And because in Shadowlands you didn't really care as much about your brain freeze procs all the time, right?
Well, I mean, the main issue, like obviously we can be talking about like in terms of DPS, like okay, so you can either have Frostbolt doing a lot of damage and not proccing a lot of stuff, or you can have Frostbolt doing little damage and proccing a lot of stuff. Which like is maybe interesting theoretical discussion, but gameplay-wise, obviously you don't want to just be spamming your filler spell even though it does a lot of damage. Obviously there's some balance to be had. You don't want your Frostbolt to always be proccing stuff. It doesn't feel great then anymore, because your procs are just like given They are not like it is something unexpected you have to react to.
Yeah, there is like a third option there, which is not upping the proc chance, but upping like the value of the procs, like just making ice lance do more damage, for example. I always think like your spenders can never do enough damage relative to your builders, because I think if your builders do too much damage, it gets degenerate. But if they do too little
Yeah,
damage, like it doesn't really
Okay,
matter.
so like
I don't know. I think about
Really?
Diablo 4 and how the builder spender relationship is in that game right now, where like your builders are just they're things you just hit in between your spenders. They do nothing, right? And it just doesn't necessarily feel good in that relationship there.
Yeah, I think it depends if it's a filler or a builder. Like if it's a filler, like you just press this when you've nothing else to press, I think it feels bad. But I think if it like contributes to something, it like feels good. Or well, not that it
Okay.
feels good, it nullifies the bad feeling, I'll just say. At least that's my opinion.
yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I could say is that there is a lot of room for Frostbolt to Frostbolt to do more damage, but I have to shift some of the like value of the procs to other spells. For example, one thing that we've been trying to get them to change is that, well, first of all, in Dragonflight we got the Flurry actually being changed to a cooldown with 2 charges if you pick a talent. It was a good change. But essentially the way it works right now is because the cooldown is 30 seconds, which is kind of long, and it's not hasted, like it doesn't scale with haste. It really isn't like cooldown, right? Because most of the casts of your flurry are still gonna be from brain freeze. Over the fight, you will get like, I don't know, 5-minute fight, you will get 10 extra flurry cast, as opposed to like, I don't know, 60 or 70 from brain freeze, which is not like a good split. So one thing that would be kind of nice in that you could have a lot more room for Frostbolt to more damage is to actually shift some of the like flurry casts from brain freeze to the base cooldown. Yeah, so this has some other implications which I think are kind of nice in that if you cannot be like if the boss is immune or like untargetable or something, you are gaining the cooldown, like your flurry cooldown is ticking, actually progresses you towards something, and also it has the nice benefit that it actually would act as a bad luck protection, because right now, even though you still have the cooldown, it really isn't a bad luck protection because you have to wait 30 seconds before you can use a proc, which is an eternity. Yeah. You could be casting, I don't know, 20 frostbolts before you get to 30 seconds. Which is like, yeah.
Yeah, I always had a different outlook on like the charges thing. I know you were kind of like the pioneer of flurry charges, but I always thought, you talked earlier about how one of the other issues with procs is like brain freeze and fingers of frost, like at the same time. Like if you fire brain freeze, get winter's chill, and shoot a fingers of frost into that, then you just waste the fingers of frost. But if you fire the fingers of frost, you risk gaining a brain freeze. And I always thought like the reason was that you could like essentially bank a brain freeze. So if you've got 0 flurry charges, you proc 1 with brain freeze, and then you've got a fingers of frost, you can then cast the fingers of frost at the end of the frostbolt and without that risk, because if you gain another brain freeze while you've got 2 charges. I always thought that was the intent behind flurry charges, but they've kind of like thrown that out the window with like brain freeze damage buff. It's kind of like, to me, it was kind of like, well, we're now back to square one. Like, what was the point in that kind of thing? So I think the idea of like shifting more towards charges maybe is a good idea.
Well, I mean, I think like the biggest issue that I'm not sure what biggest issue, but it's definitely going to be an issue that a lot of people will notice, especially Glacial Spike, because you want to be shattering your Glacial Spike with Flurry, is that a lot of times you will just be waiting for the proc. And when there's this uncertainty, when you're just looking at the cooldown, oh, it has 28 seconds remaining, it's basically unusable, right? It doesn't give you any information like, okay, if I just cast 5 more frostbolts, I will be able to use it. No, it's just like, it's basically, it basically doesn't help you get to shattering your Glacial Spike. If it had like a lower cooldown, the proc rate was lower and it was hasted, you could actually see, okay, so in 5 seconds I'm going to be able to shatter this. This is basically never going to happen with the current Brain Freeze, the current Flurry, because as I said, most of your cast from or Flurry actually come from Brain Freeze.
Do you know what helps you get Brain Freeze for your Glacial Spike? Ebb and Bolt.
Ray of Frost?
Ebb and Bolt. But yeah, it would be nice to have, we've got Water Jet now, but it would be nice to have some kind of like on-demand Brain Freeze that could sit there for a bit of time.
I don't
Not saying we want
think it has
Bolt,
to be. I don't even think it has to be on demand. It's just something that is a bit more predictable, right?
I feel like
Yeah.
you guys just need a cascading power, right?
Yeah. Do you want to do a swap? We'll give you Water Elemental for cascading power.
Oh shit.
Yeah. Yeah, one minor change you were talking about how procturations were nerfed as well. Freezing winds nerfed too.
Yeah.
3
But
seconds.
again, I think that's a good change because there are definitely, like, especially in AoE, when you were getting more orbs, there were definitely times where like you couldn't consume the charges of Fingers of Frost you were getting fast enough. So I think that's overall a good change, even though it's technically a nerf.
Yeah.
They also fixed the bug where if you cast two frozen orbs in a quick succession, you no longer just lose the freezing wind buff when the first one expires, which is a nice change. Only took them like 3 years, 4 years.
Yeah, it's
They were
been a
pretty
while.
quick about the original bug though, with freezing winds.
Yeah,
What was the original one?
you could have it up forever.
Yeah, you could
Oh,
cast
yeah.
it and then run out of a dungeon, and because the orb was in the dungeon and like the instance went away, it wouldn't like reduce the counter, and so it's thought you had one up forever.
Nice. Yeah. Right, I've got the tree up in front of me. There's some interesting things in the bottom left here. Do you want to talk about cold? Do you want to talk about coldest snap or cold front first?
Well, I guess we'll talk about Cola Snap. So they shuffled around the talents in the capstone tier a lot. I mean, we still have a Glacial Spike, but now we no longer have like Thermal Void as the capstone. Thermal Void is basically given because it's right after Ice Events, right? And it is also nerfed by a lot, which is a good change. Again, I don't think having your cooldown for over a minute was great, especially for the like rate encounters. And to replace, like to give us something new to pick in the capstone tier, they gave us the Rare Frost talents, which we already talked about. And well, I mean, we talk about Rare Frost, not the talents in particular. And they gave us Coldest Snap. So like one thing that a lot of people have been complaining about is that like Frost's AoE profile has this annoying feature where like it is doing decent damage or pretty good damage on like 2 targets because of splitting ice, and it's doing good damage on a lot of targets like 10 plus because of the interaction between Ice Collar and Frozen Orb. Like you are basically spamming Frozen Orbs at that point. But in like this middle area of like the 3 to 5 targets where the damage from splitting ice starts to fall off pretty hard, and the interaction of Ice Collar is not strong enough to pick up the pace, you have this like death spot where the AoE is kind of crappy, and we are getting actually pretty nice changes that give us something to do with like 3 to 5 targets. That isn't just like spamming Frozen Orbs. So first of all, we are getting Comet Storm, which is now actually usable and easily reachable. And the second biggest change is this talent called a Snap. So there are like 2 components. It is tied to Cone of Cold. It makes the cooldown of Cone of Cold larger for obvious reasons, as we'll see in a short moment. And then it, like when you use it on 3+ targets, it resets the cooldown of Comet Storm and Frozen Orb. So obviously this is kind of big, especially on like the lower target counts where you are not getting so many Frozen Orbs from the Ice Collar. And the second part is that it also applies Winter's Chill. So this is the first time we are actually getting an effect that allows us to shatter more than a single target without like on targets that can be frozen. Obviously, we have like pet freeze, but pet freeze is not usable on bosses or like anything that is immune to CC. And yeah, it's actually a really potent AoE burst, a really good capstone, I would say. So essentially, what you will be doing is like Frozen Orb, Comet Storm, and because Comet Storm has this 1 second duration before the comets arrive, you can fit in the Cone of Cold, which will freeze everything with Winter's Chill. Then you get another Comet Storm, another Frozen Orb, you just throw them in. Everything shatters, everything does plus 50% damage because of the shatter, like everything creates. And yeah, it's a really good AoE burst, which is something that I think Frost was lacking.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this. I think my one worry, I guess, about Comet Storm and Coldest Snap would be you're kind of talking about how Frost gets really good at the high AoE count, is that it's kind of like a linear-ish scaling, so it's like it doesn't like specifically help at those target counts more as just being like generic good AoE tools, which is still good, right? Um, just not like
I mean,
not a
you will
super
still get
surge
a lot of
offense.
value on like the 10 plus targets because of the Comet Storm reset and obviously the Shatter. And the Shatter is kind of
Yeah,
big.
yeah, that's what I mean. So like it doesn't like specifically target like 3 to 5 targets. It's just like
Right,
good on
yeah, yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Right. But the thing that I actually kind of like is that the second bit, like the resetting cooldown of Frozen, or basically does nothing on these
Yeah.
higher counts.
Yeah, that's a good
So
point.
yeah, obviously it's still pretty potent tool even on like the 10 plus targets, but it is perhaps not as potent as like it will be on 3 targets or something like that.
Yeah. Um, what do we think of Coldest Snap's neighbor? Fractured Frost and Cold Front. What about these guys hanging out?
Those are some unfortunate talents that they didn't see any changes and are still there.
Yeah, I
'Cause
feel like
right now,
in
not only are they not good, but I'm not sure if anyone actually really wants to play with them. So it's almost a good thing that they're still not good because the spec would feel worse if we had to play them.
Yeah, I will correct you. It's not almost good. It's definitely good. Yeah,
uh,
I don't think that there's any world where I would want to play with those talents.
yeah, it's almost like these are like a legendary plus Necrolord ability from last expansion, and it's kind of like you read them and it's like, oh, these synergize, like let's go into like Lords of Dread LFR and do it, and you're like, okay, that was terrible. I never want to do that again. But it's like a gimmick, and it seems like nobody, well, not nobody, but like very few people probably wanted it, but they've kind of like carried it forward just cause, and
Yeah, I think it's basically the same issue that Fire had with the like at the beginning of Dragonfly, they basically chose the talent trees based on whatever legendaries were available at the time, and I've seen it. I've heard it said many times in that Fire got frozen, like the talent got picked at the worst possible moment. Like one of the worst iterations of Fire in recent time was basically what they chose as the new talent tree, and it's not as bad for Frost, obviously, but this part of the tree is basically exactly what happened. They saw people were using Cold Front in Mythic class. People were using Cold Front because it was the best thing to be doing with Deathlord, the
Necrolord.
the Necrolord, the Necrolord ability, the Skelly Boy or whatever. And they just took it, and now we see people are playing it. Let's make it a talent.
And yeah, you're
A common misconception is that we play for fun. Really, we just play to do damage, and that's what
Yeah.
did damage at the end of Shadowlands. Yeah, I know. I'm very glad that that iteration of Shadowlands is not the best iteration of Frost right now because it was fun on Pantheon for a few pulls, and then I had enough of casting Frostbolt.
Yeah, it was really weird as well because like it wasn't even like an amazing legendary. I remember like it was seeing play in Mythic Plus with Necrolord, but like whenever you're playing Mythic Plus as Frost, you're kind of looking at your legendaries and thinking like, wow, all of these are like
Yeah.
kind of crappy to mediocre. Like I guess I'll just pick one of them, or they all have different upsides and downsides. It's like it's not like wow, I fucking love this legendary. Like give me more of this. Like yeah, I think the Blizzard haven't really read the room well on that one. Um, Other things, um, you touched on it briefly with coldest snap, but we're getting AOE Winter's Chill, but we can technically freeze targets anyway, but there's a very large discrepancy sometimes based on whether or not things are freezable. So we have like a few. So we have Frostbite in the tree and we have like Sub-Zero. I think this is maybe
Sub-Zero, yes.
what I was talking about kind of earlier when we were talking about like last season's M plus and being able to like form balanced builds. Like this is kind of where you go like firmly in the realm of like I just want to annihilate sort of small, not like freezable targets. Um, and then whenever you get onto like maybe there's a priority target that's not freezable, or there's a pack of like more elite mobs that aren't freezable, and then like talents just do like stone cold nothing. Think it's like an issue that that discrepancy exists. Do you think like some of these talents should go or be reworked or anything like that?
All right, so like I don't think that there is a discrepancy at all is an issue. Like I think it's a nice feature that the spec just does a little bit more damage when you can actually freeze the targets. But the issue is like how much. Obviously, if you are getting so much damage that you are completely like, let's say there is a 30% delta between your AoE when the targets are freezable and when they are not, which is pretty close to what we'll be looking at with the Sub-Zero and Frostbite and whatever. And now Blizzard basically has two options. It can either balance you around doing damage to the freezable targets, and if they do, you are just useless on like whenever there's a raging week and mobs drop below 30%, just completely useless. 30% of your damage is gone. If you're in a raid, obviously most targets, like if you're doing AoE in, like if there's an AoE encounter, like a boss fight, there's some ads that can be frozen, boom, your damage is just completely in the dust. And then the other option is that they balance you around your damage that you do to targets that can be frozen, then you're just completely busted whenever the targets can be frozen. So there needs to be a balance between, like, it's a nice feature to have, like, okay, so we can actually use the freeze to do a bit more damage, but there needs to be, like, it cannot be overpowering to the point where we are either busted when the mobs can be frozen or completely useless when they cannot be.
Yeah. Do you
How
think
much of that
maybe
is how much of that is attributable to the class tree talents, Ice Nova and the Ice Ward extra Nova charge?
I don't think it's much, actually. Obviously, like, Ice Nova plus, what's it called? Time manipulation? The one that reduces the
time
cooldown of Ice
manipulation?
Nova, yeah. Obviously has some effect, but I think the bigger reason is that we now have everyone is going to be running water elemental because it is now part of Icy Veins, which gives you pet freeze on 25-second cooldown, which you can actually use to shatter exactly what you want. You can pick when to actually cast it. You can easily shatter Comet Storm, which I mean, I guess you can technically do with Ice Nova as well, but it's a bit more involved, let's say. Because the cooldowns need to line up. With Pet Freeze, we are basically just free to use it whenever. And the fact that we also have Comet Storm is like, because Blizzard and Frozen Orb do the damage like in a very slow fashion, like it takes 10 seconds or 12 seconds for Frozen Orb to do all its damage. It gets some benefit from these random freezes, but it's not that much. And then you have Comet Storm, which basically concentrates all the damage into 1.4 seconds. Actually, technically 1.2 seconds. And you can easily get Shatter on all of the 6 or 7 hits with just one freeze. So I think it's more to do with Pet Freeze and actually having Comet Storm, which really benefits from shattering.
Yeah. Yeah, something I was thinking would be Like if Sub-Zero went, but then that doesn't really solve the issue of like those spells based on duration just interact completely differently. I think
Yeah, I think Sub-Zero should definitely go. I think it's a bit too much.
Yeah.
Because it's the talent which is basically useless unless the targets can be frozen. It doesn't do anything else, and the 20% is actually kind of crazy if you think about it. 20% damage on your Combat Storm is kind of a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, especially on certain pulls, like maybe the beginning of like Algathar Academy or something like that. It's gonna do a lot.
Yeah, there's also because you will be able to shatter your glacial spikes that cleave for 100% of your damage. That's also going to be a big deal if the targets can be frozen and you can just get free 20% damage on glacial spike and on 2 targets, and also obviously the shatter and everything.
Glacial Strike still doesn't shatter itself. You like pet freeze it, right?
Yeah, you need to
Yeah.
either cast Ice Nova after it or Pet Freeze when it's about to like hit.
You can Frost Nova too.
You can Frost
And
Nova,
like
yes.
Shimmer Nova if you're
I'm
far
not
away as well.
sure it's actually good using Frost Nova, but it might be, honestly. Because Glacial Spike is going to be doing so much damage that you probably want to spend a 1 GC to just get the 50% extra crit, and obviously you have 20% extra crit damage from one talent, 10% extra from another talent, and then Sub-Zero another 20% damage. Yeah, probably.
There's always opportunities too for that at like the end of Mem Plus pulls and stuff like that when you're cleaning up mobs to like waste a GCD on Nova or something just to improve your
definitely.
last big hit.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else on Frost hasn't been hit?
Let me check.
Is the one thing we didn't really talk about is with the mastery changes, that historically when they introduced mastery, a lot of them were like not just boring flat damage increases. And now with this change to icicles needed something to change because they clearly weren't working. But now it's more of just a flat damage buff to a whole bunch of spells. And it makes it in some ways not a whole lot different from stats like Verse. And so just as far as like how interesting the stats are, that's maybe a small step backwards, even if it's better for the spec overall.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult to accomplish like balanced, interesting masteries. Maybe like Ignite is kind of closer to. I mean, well, we've also spent time talking about
Ignite's
the
a little
problems
something now, but at least historically, Ignite has at least been good while being not just a straight flat damage effect.
I mean,
Yeah,
there,
a good,
there was a time when Fire Master was increasing your DOT damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Predates me if that existed. I think it was always Ignite whenever I played.
And then in Shadowlands, the Arcane Mastery didn't affect all spells, right? That was something added in.
Yeah, in Legion they just made it affect. Like Legion is the time when they changed the master from the old one, which was increased damage based
Mana
on
related,
your
right?
mana. Yeah. And in Legion they turn it into increases the effectiveness of arcane charges and increases your mana pool and mana regen. And then they slowly started realizing that that
It's not enough, and
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so like this is something that we've been harping on about for a long time, but Frost had a mastery which they removed because of PvP concerns and also PvE concerns, because it wasn't great in PvE and it was overpowered in PvP, which was the Frostburn mastery, where your spells are doing more damage to frozen targets, which would include Winter's Chill and everything. Because like on single targets right now we are doing about 70-80% of our total damage to frozen targets by Winter's Chill and Fingers of Frost. It will actually work quite well, so that might be an option.
Yeah, whereas there's probably a lot lower back then, especially with now it's like Cold as Snap, would like work as well in AoE.
Yeah. It's especially also always good to have masteries, I think, encourage playing the spec properly, whatever spec it is. like for fire, ignites better when you spend hot streaks, and so it encourages using those quickly and not wasting your crits. So having something that interacts more directly with shatter would probably be good for frost.
Yeah. It's a good shout. Yeah. Are we...
Yeah, one
We
more
good
thing
then?
that I maybe want to add is that there were some concerns about Frost having too many buttons. And I think like if Blizzard didn't actually do that one fix where they removed one bolt and restricted Cold Snap to 3+ targets, I think those people would probably have a point. Like having to deal with Cone of Cold in single target would probably be a bit too much. But I just want to say that Frost essentially being a 3-spec button and gaining 2 or 3 extra buttons doesn't mean it's a button bloat. There's a lot of specs in the game that have like basic rotation consisting of 5 buttons, and it's perfectly okay. So I don't think like Frost having 5 spells in the basic rotation is a like big issue. Obviously, there are people that play Frost because it is like exceptionally simple in the you just need 4 keybinds for your main spells and that's it. Though I will say that current Frost has a lot of hidden complexity in that if you cannot keep your ice events up all the time, you will lose a ton of damage, and that's kind of hard for people that maybe you want to pick an easier class to do. So it will be like, yeah, it's getting a bit harder, so those people might not actually like it. But I think the spec as overall for everyone that wants to actually perform well with the spec is getting a lot easier because you no longer have to dance around ice events all the time.
Yeah, I think back in BFA, which was probably the last time Frost had like a lot of buttons. Like I think the spec was like fairly well received. I don't remember there being lots of complaints at that time, so hopefully it'll be something similar. Okay. Right. Not gonna ask you what you think the best spec is because that's bait. But biggest winner and biggest loser from the rework. Porum, you go. In terms of specs. You're muted.
You're muted.
I would say
I thought we were
the
gonna, I thought we were
biggest
gonna get through
loser.
3 hours without having to say that. We haven't.
I think the biggest loser is probably Arcane and probably mostly orientated on a single target. Maybe not being touched is a good thing. But I think there's a couple of core issues there that were largely ignored and are just going to persist for the rest of the expansion now, right? I think Frost probably is the one I would say that won out the most. I think Fire probably went the furthest distance from where it was to where it is now, but I think Frost made a similar kind of distance, and I think it made it in a much better direction. I think the Frost profile is going to open it up in raids and Mythic Plus in a way that I don't think it even had a chance of being considered in some cases. Like Sarkareth bomb running, you would never pick a Frost Mage for that right now, right? But after this rework, that might be a serious consideration to have Frost run that and get the haste buff and pump their Icy Veins cooldown into it, you know? Whereas Fire is still kind of that flattish profile where it's a bit more still reliant on uptime, I feel. And I worry that that's going to that combined with the ignite change in their AoE kit change might end up precluding it from certain situations where you want to have that priority damage and still need to have a healthy amount of AoE going out as well. So yeah, I think biggest loser probably Arcane single target just by virtue of not really being changed, and I think biggest winner is Frost all around.
Darwin, what about you?
I'd say I think the biggest loser overall is probably Ignite in general, because even on single target, it's just not very good anymore. And Mastery for Fire is just potentially the worst stat now in all situations. But then for the biggest winner, I think I'd agree that it's Frost because most of that spec's problems have just been resolved with Frostbolt being too good and Mastery pushing like the active buttons out of the rotation completely. So it was really nice to see those changes to that spec.
Yeah. Norner, what about you?
Yeah, so I'll definitely agree that Frost is the biggest winner of these changes. I will try to play devil's advocate and disagree with Poro. I think Fire is the loser here. I think like Fire got much better changes than Arcane did, but Fire also made a lot more changes. And some of the changes that Fire got, like with the UI not being quite good enough and this Firefall weirdness that we have this build that picks living bomb at all. I just think Fire needed a bit more. Like obviously it got more changes than Arcane. I think the changes overall are better than what Arcane got, but I think it needed much more. So for me, I think the biggest loser is gonna be Fire.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Fire's the loser here. I think Arcane got the least changes, but I think it was pretty close to a complete spec, and I like the changes. I think Fire is gonna. I'm struggling like as a Mythic Raider to kind of think like where am I actually going to play Fire? Like its profile kind of like loses out in the profile department, and Mythic Plus it doesn't have the good AoE and single target, and there's a couple of other issues around Ignite, and yeah, I'm struggling to see when I want to play Fire if it wasn't overtuned. And yeah, I agree. The winner here is Frost. So you heard it here first. 4 Frosts. Spec is open next patch.
For what it's worth, I actually thought about this question prior to joining. And I actually debated on whether I should plug Arcane for the worst, so it's more likely that we get buffs, or whether I should just say that, honestly, mages kind of won in general. Like, I think Mass Barrier, Mass Invis, Ice Cold are absolutely massive successes for us. Getting Meteor out of the class tree, and even though we didn't get rid of shifting power, just getting it in a position where it doesn't prepare you for frustration to pick up. Yeah, it's just the overall win for mages, I think.
Yeah, like apart from like we obviously mentioned a lot of these issues, but overall I think the changes have been excellent. So I cannot complain too much. Obviously there's some stuff that we would like to get stale, but definitely satisfied my expectations of the rework, maybe exceeded them even.
Yeah, never want to sound too negative, especially for a mid-expansion rework. I would agree. It's very, very good. Okay. Anything else anyone wants to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, they still forgot to increase the radius of Frozen Orb.
It is true.
Yeah, remove Temp Orb. There we go.
Yeah, let us place Frozen Orb on our cursor.
That would be the
That's
best, yes.
Yeah, the
It's
technology
kind of funny
in the
because
game.
they now put it into the patch notes that they increased the radius and they didn't.
Was that on PTR notes? Was that supposed to happen?
Yeah, it was like it was in PTR notes, increase radius of Frozen Orb by 15%. Then it's in the actual notes that were just published like today. So plus 15% radius, and it just didn't happen.
Wow.
I wonder if they did something and we just haven't noticed it. Like they increased something that's not the radius of it. I don't know.
I did check in game because I was like, okay, so maybe we didn't just see the spell data, but no, it has the actual radius. It is on live. If you go to target enemies and check it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, at least we've got it in writing so that now we can hold them to it. It's like,
We'll try to.
Where is our Frozen Orb range? But yeah. Okay.
I'm going to use my next article about the Arcane utility point I was supposed to get.
Yeah. I've just got more damage. Like, what the hell, Blizzard? Yeah. Okay. It's coming up on 3 a.m. in Europe. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Very nice talking to you. Yeah. See you in the next one. Hopefully we'll maybe like to do something like this at least every patch, but we'll see where this goes. Thank you everybody in chat.
Us.
Yeah,
thanks a lot. Take
thanks
care,
everybody
everyone.
in chat. I am flying out to TwitchCon in the morning. I will upload this to YouTube probably tonight or tomorrow morning. If you're at TwitchCon, say hi. But yeah,